Jim Turley's looking good today. Get a haircut.
Looks like Ellen Nielsen.
It is.
Afternoon.
Jim blacked himself out.
Jim.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call the special meeting of Nanaimo City Council to order. Recognize firstly we are gathered on the traditional territory of the Same First Nation. Our clerk today will be Ms. Shivaguri. Today's special meeting of council will be held in accordance with the Community Charter, Council Procedure Bylaw 2018, number 7272, and Ministerial Order number M083. Therefore, members of the public are required to observe meetings virtually and not attend in person. The question period will be suspended throughout the duration of this order being in effect. Council will attend via Zoom at these special meetings or in person, maintaining physical distancing at all times. And members of staff that are partaking in the meeting will be spread out in the boardroom accordingly, which is happening as we speak. And the first item on the agenda is the introduction of late items. Ms. Curry, please.
Thank you, Your Worship. There's just one late item today, and that's the addition of a delegation from Kate Stefia regarding agenda item 5A, Councillor Brown's motion relocation of roadway space. And that's it.
Very good. Motion for approval of the agenda is amended. Moved Councillor Thorpe, seconded Councillor Martin. All those in favor? Councillor Turley, as usual, unless I hear an objection from you, I assume you're a yay and not a nay?
Sounds good.
Very good. Thank you very much. First item of any substance, item 4, reports, and it's the Animal Control Service Review. Mr. Lindsay.
Thank you, Your Worship.
Nice jacket.
That's a nice guy.
They're twins.
That's all right. Mr. Carson likes it.
Good afternoon, Council. Yes, that's right. City of Nanaimo Board. The report you have before you, and in just a minute I'm going to turn it over to allow for a more general discussion on the report from Mr. Nielsen. I just want to give Council a little bit of background, and this really started with two things. One is when we're putting our 2020 budgets together, we're seeing a number of capital improvements that will be required for the Pound and Adoption Facility out on Nanaimo Lakes Road. And if Council's aware, that's a building that the city's had for many years and is requiring some upgrades. And at the same time, we knew that our contract with our service provider was coming out, was ending in the middle of this year. We thought it was a good time to step back and do a service delivery review of the entire service and provide some overview and some recommendation to allow us to move forward, help us make decisions about should we be renewing a contract, should we be making those investments in that existing facility. So that service review has now been complete, and Mr. Nielsen's here this afternoon to make his presentation and outline his findings for you. So unless there's any questions of myself, I also have Mr. Auberge and Mr. Corson here with me who are authors of this report, and I'm certainly happy to answer questions, but unless there's any questions of staff, we'll turn it over for the presentation.
Looks like we're good to go. Mr. Nielsen, welcome.
Thank you, Mayor Crowe. It's a pleasure to be here, I suppose. I will just share the screen, if that's okay, and go walk through the presentation. Is that visible to everybody?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Your Worship, for having me at the meeting today to present this report. As Mr. Lindsay mentioned, the report has really kind of been undertaken as an opportunity. Well, first of all, to focus on the two items that Mr. Lindsay mentioned, that is with respect to the service model and then also the Pound and Adoption Center. But it did provide an opportunity when looking at those two items to look a little more holistically at the service as a whole, because the service hasn't been reviewed in to any degree for some time. So staff, I think, took the opportunity to proceed in that fashion and asked me to assist them with that. So just with respect to the overview of what I'd like to talk about, what I'd like to share with you today, Your Worship, is we'll start off by just kind of talking a bit about the purpose and scope of the service review, which I just outlined briefly. little bit about the existing service, just so council's aware of where we're starting from. Some of the key issues that I uncovered through my review, which looked not only at the city service itself, of course, but also at some comparative places too. And those issues include dog licensing, the scope of the service, delivery model, staffing level, the Pounded Adoption Center, cats in an animal, education, and the licensing and control of animals bylaw, and then of course the recommendations at the end. I'll try to move through fairly quickly, Your Worship, and just touch on some key points. If I'm moving too slowly or too quickly, I'll just wait for council to advise me accordingly. So as Mr. Lindsay mentioned, the particular review that we've got in front of us today was prompted by the expiration of a contract. So the contract with Nanaimo Animal Control Limited is going to expire at the end of August of this year. It has already been extended on one occasion, and it doesn't have a provision for a further extension. So a look needed to be done at the service to determine whether or not there was going to be an extension of or a new service contract out in an RFP. And so again, we took some opportunity to look more holistically. So in terms of the two specific advice issues on which advice was required, the service delivery model, which as I just noted is focused on the use of a for-profit company to deliver the service on behalf of the city, and then the facility that Mr. Lindsay talked about being a fairly old facility on Nanaimo Lakes, South Lakes Road, and the concern around that facility on a go-forward basis and the need for some changes there. Your Worship, when we look at the existing service, a few things to point out. First of all, it does have a broad scope, and we see there on page 3 of my report, we kind of capture the different elements of the service, a very broad service scope, which is not unlike other services in other municipalities. But in general, the existing animal control service really focuses on regulating the keeping and treatment of animals. Not only dogs are the focus, but in Nanaimo we actually go beyond dogs to look at other kinds of animals too, including cats and then livestock and poultry and rabbits and so forth. The focus really though is on dogs and cats, so domestic animals, domestic pets really. When we look at that, the entire breadth of the scope, we've got, of course, the enforcement of the bylaw, we've got the sale and tracking of dog licenses, the operation of the pound and the adoption center, the placement through adoption of and pound of unclaimed animals. There's emergency assistance to deal with vicious dogs and other animal-related matters. The provision of support to our first responders at Nanaimo Fire Rescue and Nanaimo RCMP. One point which we'll talk about in a little more depth, carcasses from public lands, and care for injured animals, and then finally a public education component of the service as well. The legislative framework for the service is really kind of dominated by the city's main animal control bylaw, which is the licensing and control of animals bylaw. I won't go into any detail on that. We do bring forward some suggested changes to the bylaw a little bit later, however. The delivery model does, as we've talked about already, feature a private company to deliver the service on behalf of the city. The city is involved, of course, in setting policy for the service and in overseeing the work of the contractor, and that's Mr. Rivera's department and, of course, in Mr. Lindsay's area in the community planning, and more specifically in the bylaw enforcement division that oversees that contract and the work of that agency. The finance department, however, also is involved through the sales and management of that. But the focus really is on this contract service provider. And as I mentioned, the service contract that is currently in place with this provider is up at the end of the summer. And so there does need to be some decision made with respect to whether to go up to a new RFP or change the service model. But in the report, it does talk about the different things that fall under the purview of the contract delivered by Nanaimo Animal Control. And there's nothing surprising there. It just kind of mirrors the breadth of the service scope. When we look at service finances, just a couple of key points here. Really, we're talking about an annual average net cost of about $250,000, which is honestly not really that alarming, if I can presume to say that. I mean, we don't like, of course, as the government to see any annual net cost, but these types of services don't typically make money, and Nanaimo was no exception to that. But it's $250,000 compared to some other places is not tremendously high, so that's perhaps something to take some comfort with. When we look at services statistics, one of the functions of one of the activities that the Nanaimo Animal Control does on behalf of the city, and the city participates in this as well, is the collection of different data on the service. And these data are important, of course, because they help us in studies like this to determine where some changes may be required or may at least need to be explored. And I'll just highlight a couple of different items in here for Council, Your Worship. I've highlighted these particular items because they're ones that I want to look at a little bit later in more detail with Council. The first is the percent of dogs licensed. And over a 4-year period, these are the last 4 full years that the service has been provided under the current contract. We see an average of about 50%, 52% over on an annual basis. It goes everywhere from 46 up to 59, but on average about 52% of dogs are licensed. Conversely, we can say then that about half of dogs are not licensed in the city. Dogs without licenses, so we see these are the numbers of dogs that were identified through checks as not having licenses, and those are not insignificant. The expenses, the giving out of information pamphlets, very small numbers there, and education, as we see a little bit later in the report, is a very important function in the service, and so that's something we would like to see a little bit higher. And then this one's particularly key because it talks about animal carcasses taken to the morgue. This number includes all animals. As we see a little bit later, though, we can actually see up in the numbers above, the deceased dogs are very small, just a few a year, and deceased cats again, 37 in 2019. So most of those deceased animals taken to the morgue are other large animals such as deer. Going back to the existing services, rounding this out, we do have some other agencies. When we look at the animal control program, or if you will, the kind of ecosystem, if I can put it that way, in Nanaimo, very similar to other cities, Nanaimo does have other agencies involved to complement the activities and supplement the activities of the city government. And in our case, we've got 2 in particular, and then one, the RDNO, or the Regional District of Nanaimo as well. One is the BC SPCA, of course, and that's, as everybody I think knows, SPCA is a not-for-profit, volunteer-driven society that deals particularly with animal welfare. Excuse me, it has a number of different functions: adopting out animals, caring for abused and homeless animals. It also provides kind of discount spay and neuter programs, and then, of course, is the designated body for the provincial government to conduct animal cruelty investigations. I think Council is probably aware that in 2016, the branch opened its new Community Animal Control Center, I beg your pardon, Community Animal Center on Westwood Road, and that was about a $3.5 million building. The city gave a $50,000 grant to that to help to assist with the capital. Another key agency that does need to be identified here. Sorry, was there a question? Oh, I beg your pardon. Okay, sorry, I thought I heard something. Another key agency, Your Worship, which does need to be identified here is the Catnap Society. This society is a not-for-profit rescue organization run entirely by volunteers. It brings in 500 cats a year through what is called a TNR program, a trap, a neuter, and release program. It's a program by which volunteers of the society will trap cats, bring them in, neuter them, care for them, and then release them either to, if they're able to be adopted, to different households or to different farms, or back into the community. And I'll just mention, finally, we do, of course, have the RDN, and the RDN is responsible for animal control outside of the city limits in the unincorporated areas. It does have a bylaw in place that covers areas A, B, C, and also the District of Landsville. It's a fairly basic service. There's There's no dog licensing, for example, under that service. It is delivered by a third party as well, Coast Animal Services, which was the company that used to have the contract in Nanaimo some time ago. Your Worship, I'll move on if I may and just outline the issues to address. Are there any, before I kind of proceed, are there any comments or questions at this point?
Councillor Bonner.
Thank you, Worship. Through you to our most esteemed animal expert here. Thank you, appreciate that. It's regarding expenses. In your figure 2.1, one of the things that I don't think's in there, and it's not huge, it's like $22,000, it's the permissive tax exemption that we give to the SPCA. So our contribution is, yeah, it's not really easily found. My only question is, it's about $22,000 a year. Does that make any difference in your recommendations of expenses? Are we still average compared to other folks?
Thank you very much for the question, and through the mayor, if I may, that wouldn't probably change my conclusion, my observation that we're still pretty well off compared to other places. The area I'm most knowledgeable about in terms of animal control is, or by comparison at least, is the Central Okanagan, and there for some time prior to 2013. Now it's a service about twice the size of that of Nanaimo, but if we kind of take that into account, prior to 2014, they had a net cost of about $1 million. And they're now down to a net cost of about $500,000 after extensive change. So that would still bring it very much on a per capita basis, kind of in line with the City of Nanaimo service.
Great, thanks.
But I'm very glad that you mentioned that permissive tax exemption. I did not have that in my notes. I apologize for that. And it does allow me just to point out as well, if I may, Your Worship, that this report very much is a draft report. And so all of these changes that come forward through this discussion, I'll be sure to put into the final version.
Thank you very much. I think that's it for questions, so please carry on.
Thank you very much. When we look at issues to address then, and they're, depending how deep one digs, you can find almost an unlimited number of issues in any service. And so it always takes some judgment to kind of identify, and also the input from others too, to identify what the key issues are. And so I've tried to kind of focus on some key issues for council's consideration here. And the first issue is dog licensing. We note, first of all, that dog licensing is not unique at all to the City of Nanaimo. It's fairly standard in almost every jurisdiction, with one exception being the RDN on the skirts of the city, the outskirts of the city. But it is fairly common. It is required by the city's bylaw, and so that's kind of the number one point to make. It is the importance of dog licensing is very well established in kind of the animal control literature and in animal control services wherever they're provided. And it's important for a number of different reasons, and the city does a very good job of identifying these different reasons on its website for animal control. It talks about, those who don't license can be fined, of course. If we do have a dog license, we are able then, if we take in that dog, to reunite it very quickly. You'll save money on having to get your dog out of the pound, because those who have taken the time to license their dog will have a discount there, and so forth. There's a number of different reasons as to why it's very important. When we talk about purchasing a license under the existing system, right now the city has a purchase price of $30. That's reduced to $25. That's not out of line by any stretch with any other jurisdiction that I was able to find. Some will be a little bit higher, some a little bit lower, but that's very common. That's a very kind of appropriate, if I can, or comparable price to other places. One point that's very interesting about the City of Nanaimo's licensing system, and we'll get to this in a little bit as well, is that it is a single tier or single price system that differentiate among different types of dogs, or I should say among different, when I say types of dogs, those dogs that are intact and those that have been spayed and neutered. Nor does it apply separate fees for dogs that may be identified as aggressive or vicious under the bylaw. So that does make Nanaimo very unique compared to most other places, certainly every other place that I know of. dog licenses are kind of purchased in person at City Hall or the Pound and Adoption Center. They can be renewed online. That point we'll come back to in a moment as well. Licensing offenses, we've got those listed in our bylaw, of course, and I'll come back to those points in a moment. Your Worship, when we look at dog licensing, then there are some changes that we have put forward to consider here. The first thing that's worth noting, however, before we get into the specific changes, is that when we look at water and animal control services, we very much kind of look at the concept and we view them through the concept of responsible pet ownership. And this concept recognizes that the potential for pets to play a positive role in the community is dependent almost entirely on the attitudes and the actions of pet owners. So that concept puts a tremendous onus and responsibility, as is appropriate, on the owners of the animals. Now, the annual purchase of a dog license is, again, when we look at other jurisdictions and we look at the literature, is very much the first condition of responsible pet ownership. So, put simply, responsible pet owners buy dog licenses. And when we look at, and people who buy licenses respect the law, they want to give their dogs the best chance of being reunited if they're injured or they're lost, and they also recognize that the revenue from the license goes entirely to help pay for the service that really is only required because we have people who own dogs and other animals. So it is very much kind of a key element of responsible pet ownership. I mentioned earlier when we looked at the stats that we have about 50, just slightly more than 50% of dog owners in Nanaimo who have chosen to license their dogs. That means 50%, or about half of dog owners, don't license their dogs. And that's something that we want to focus on in the changes. Now, when we look at kind of increasing that 50% number to something a little bit better, and by the way, when we look around the province and the country, we can kind of, we have some targets that we can move to. Again, RDCO, the Regional District Central Okanagan, which provides the service, I should mention, just to kind of, for the efforts or to kind of enhance the comparison here. It provides the service of the City of Kelowna, the City of West Kelowna, and then 2 other municipalities in the area. So it is kind of an urban service as well. When we look at that service, it went from a licensing rate of 30% in 2013 to 75% today. So it is very possible to increase these, and we see other places that have moved up into the 70s, and in one case even 90 in the City of Calgary.
I have a question, Mr. Wilson. I have a question from Councillor Martin.
Through you, Your Worship, how did they do that?
Well, that's what we're going to outline right now.
Okay.
So yes, that's a very good question, and I've got the answers.
Set up.
So further to that question, that's a perfect segue into this next block. There are a number of different ways to do that, and like any good kind of policy that we're going for, like any good program, there's not one silver bullet. So we need to look at a number of different elements. The first is getting the word out. And when we talk about getting the word out, it's like, how do we make sure, we can say almost cynically, how do we make sure that nobody can claim they didn't know they had to get a license? We can say less cynically, how do we make sure that people really understand the importance of getting a dog license and how to go about getting it? So we've got, I mentioned earlier, we've got on the city's website right now some very good information on kind of why it's important to get that. Earlier, when I looked at the statistics, one of the areas I highlighted was the number of information pamphlets given out kind of in person by animal control officers to dog owners as they encounter them in parks. And it was very low, less than 10 or fewer than 10. So one thing that we need to do then is develop, in my view, develop a more complete communication strategy that really targets both existing license holders, but also those who have not purchased a license before. When we look at some other jurisdictions, we see that we can do that through notices in local printed and online media. And the city does do one release a year on that to remind people around the time of license renewal, and that's good, but we can do a little bit more. Radio notices, social media notices, roadside signs. So here in Kelowna, every time we get towards license purchase, as you drive home on one of the main roads, you'll see one of those pop-up road signs saying, don't forget to get your license, get it here, go online, so forth. Posters in in transit stops. So if you go to the city of Vancouver or many other cities, you'll see in different transit stops posted reminding people about the importance and the rules around dog licensing. And then we've got another idea of pet ambassador, which I'm going to come to a little bit later. So information is kind of a big item to begin with. Another, though, key one, and if there were a silver bullet, I think this would be the one. And this is dropping barriers to purchasing. So the main barrier, well, there are two different barriers to purchasing to highlight. One deals with the cost of licenses. In Nanaimo, that's not a barrier. You've got nice low cost on your licenses, so that's good. But the other key license is how do we purchase them? Is it convenient for people to go purchase them? Because if it's not convenient, even though people may know they're supposed to purchase them, some of them just won't purchase them. So most cities, in fact, almost every city allows owners to purchase renewal licenses. That is to renew existing licenses through online systems. An increasing number of places allow owners to purchase new licenses online. And that's very important because that significantly drops the barrier. And so in the Central Okanagan, we attribute most of the increase in that license, in those license sales, to the ability to purchase online. In fact, Central Okanagan now allows people to do it through an app. So it's very simple. One of the other points that has been made as well, and it's relevant, less relevant if we have online purchase of new licenses, which is the preferred, but if we don't have that, another important point is to say, well, let's increase the number of places at which people can buy new licenses. In Nanaimo right now, we have two places, City Hall or the Pound. And let's face it, the Pound is kind of in the middle of nowhere, so basically we have City Hall. In Victoria, they've got 13 places, only 3 of which are city facilities, so they contract to other retailers and such. In the Okanagan, prior to it going online, we had 11 places people could buy licenses, so that's important. We talked about licensing costs as being important, and one of the points to make in looking at changes is not so much dropping the cost of the license, because that's important, but to look at license pricing as a licensing tool that can really assist the city in achieving different goals. So everywhere else that we look at pricing, then we've got differentiated prices to use this as a policy tool to encourage certain behaviors, such as, for example, having a dog license, but also making sure the dogs are spayed or neutered, and to discourage certain behaviors, so keeping dogs intact, and then to address impacts imposed by aggressive dogs. So looking at different license rates for that, and I've suggested in the text here some different license rates to consider that would not be out of line with your neighboring jurisdictions to the south and further to the north. Excuse me. Now, one of the other points that was very important in addressing licensing rates in not only the Central Okanagan, but in other places as well, and Calgary, Winnipeg, places like that really come to mind when we look at this next approach, is to say we're going to have a zero tolerance approach to non-licensing. So in other places, and it's standard with bylaw enforcement and animal control, that we want to encourage our animal control officers, or in some cases our bylaw enforcement officers, to help people comply, to use education, to use soft enforcement, to kind of get people to change their behaviors without coming down hard on people. And that's fine. But when it comes to licensing, what we suggested is, because it is the first condition of responsible pet ownership, let's instead and borrow from these other places and say, when it comes to licensing, we have instructed our enforcement officers to take a zero tolerance approach. So that means that while they may be able to give you a warning if your dogs are large or off leash or those kinds of things, if you don't have a license, you will get a significant fine. And that's beyond the discretion of the officers. Now, when we look at the Central Okanagan and Winnipeg and Calgary, it's $300. It's $150 if you pay in the Okanagan within 2 weeks. I'm not suggesting that for Nanaimo, because in those other places, that the imposition of those fines, or the introduction of those fines, was part of a very kind of broad, community-wide approach to redesigning the service. But I have suggested to bring it in line with places, with the cost in Victoria and other places, and simply just take that zero tolerance approach.
I have a question for Councillor. Mr. Nielsen, I have a question from Councillor Markman again.
Thank you. Through you, Your Worship. Does anyone and you're right, I think a price point, if we were to have zero tolerance, 300 would be too much. But does anyone in that fine that the person's supposed to pay include the dog license? By the way, not only will you pay this fine, but with this fine comes a dog license, making it incorporated into it.
No, they don't. They always have that as a separate. They say that you must pay in some cases the 300, but in all cases, whatever the fine is, pay the fine, and then you must buy a license.
Yeah, might be interesting to have it include the license.
That's a possibility, for sure.
Councillor Bonner has a question as well.
Thank you. In your investigations of other municipalities, do you find places where the vets sell dog licenses?
Yes, and if we look at City of Victoria, I believe a number of vets will sell them there in addition to pet stores as well. And I know in the Okanagan, prior to introducing the online option to purchase new licenses, they had vets do it here as well.
And I don't know who to ask this question to, but can we legally require that they sell licenses?
That's an interesting, if I can answer it, that's an interesting question. I suppose you could make it a condition of their operation under their business license. I suspect that most of them would probably want to do it anyway because they understand the importance of it and because they typically get a commission. It's not a large commission, but I think that they would be the first to say that responsible pet ownership requires a license. The more we can do to help with that, the better.
And the other one, if I may, could a control officer or bylaw officer, is it possible, I think it's technically possible, sell licenses as they're walking about?
Absolutely. And I think that your current officers have that capability. I don't believe they have kind of at source point and tap with these, although I may be wrong on that because I do know that they sell licenses in person. In some places they do actually have, it's just kind of like we're all getting used to now, just the tap, the easy tap of your credit card. But yeah, for sure.
And one last question, do you have any municipalities that restrict access to, say, dog off-leash parks if you don't have a license? Like the gate won't open unless you have a license.
That's a really good question. I'm not aware of that. I suppose that people without licenses may be reluctant to go in there because they'd be a little bit more vulnerable in terms of getting caught. But it's a really interesting idea of having to put a code in or something to kind of get in, and the code is given to you with your license. I haven't come across that. That's very interesting.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to stop now because I think I've endeared myself to all the dog owners throughout the Niles.
Please carry on.
Thank you, Your Worship. A reward program, just one future thing to note, and I don't get into it in any detail here because our study was a little more focused both in terms of time and scope, but one idea that a number of places have picked up on is the idea now of offering a reward program. In Calgary it's called I Love My Dog or I Heart My Dog, in the Okanagan it's called My Dog Matters. In other places they've got similar names. It's an app-based program. It allows people very quickly to get back the cost of their license because they get discounts from local shop owners and so forth. In the Okanagan, for example, there are over 70 different businesses in town, some pet-related, some have nothing to do with pets, which will give discounts to anybody who has purchased a license. And you just show your app with your number and you get a discount, and within a couple of weeks you've got back your investment. So lots of different ideas there. Moving on, if I may, Your Worship, just in terms of scope of service, because this was another one of the issues we wanted to look at. Scope of service, I talked about earlier that the scope is very broad. I won't go into that any more detail. We talked about that already. And it's not that different from some other places, with two exceptions to that. The first is responsibility for deceased animals. Nanaimo does appear to be unique in assigning responsibility for dealing with animal carcasses in public spaces, on streets, on beaches and parks and so forth, to the animal control officers. And when we talk about animal carcasses, we're not just talking about small animals, we're talking about deer, we're talking about those kinds of size animals, which can take a tremendous amount of effort and time. Typically, the animal control officers work alone. They have kind of MacGyvered some various contraptions to allow them to transport a deer carcass, but it's not uncommon for an animal control officer to spend half a shift or a shift dealing with a deer carcass. And so it is, that's not a great use of time, especially when we have other departments with heavy equipment who are out and about on city roads who could maybe deal with that. So one of the things I've suggested here is to transfer responsibility for deceased animals to Public Works. I have got a caveat in there. I suggested that responsibility for cats and dogs that die remain with ACO, with animal control officers, and that's because simply they have received training on how to deal with the often distraught owner at that time, because that's an kind of service as well. The other point I make under here, Your Worship, is related to dog-related noise complaints. Right now, we had in 2019 or 2019, 192 noise complaints that were dog-related. At the city right now, the investigation of those, the attendance to those calls falls to the bylaw enforcement officers. That's fine. However, we're missing some opportunities there because the bylaw enforcement officers typically don't deal with animal complaints. They'll deal with more human-related complaints. The animal control officers, if they attend to those different noise complaints, which is quite standard across the industry, they'll be able to identify other related issues and also have an opportunity to speak with owners on it, provide some education and so forth. So what I've suggested, Your Worship, in here, and it comes back later to us in the recommendations, is a little bit of a shuffling of the deck. Move the responsibility for deceased animals to Public Works, with the exception of dog and cat carcasses, and move dog-related noise complaints from bylaw enforcement to animal control. When we look at the delivery model, one of the other issues, and you'll recall that this particular issue, the delivery model, was one of the two main ones that the city did want some advice on, in addition to the other ones which we talked about in the more holistic look as well. As I noted earlier, the delivery model features a contract to a for-profit private company. And the question really is whether to continue to contract that service out, as is currently the case, or to bring it in-house and have it assigned to a particular city department. So what are the different considerations that we would want to look at in answering this question? The first is, which costs more? Well, we haven't done in this particular study kind of a detailed kind of accounting of or cost comparison, but we have done kind of a broader overview of what we think it would cost. And when we kind of look at wages paid to bylaw enforcement officers, clerk, receptionists, kennel workers, which by the way are the same under both models, when we take that into account, when we take into account the dollar value of benefits, which would be higher under the city than they currently are under the contractor, overtime and emergency call-out figures, a portion of management time within the city to oversee direct staff, amortized costs for vehicles and equipment, because right now under our contract with our private company, it is responsible for providing almost all of the equipment and vehicles. When we look at the equipment required to operate the pound and adoption center, that's another factor. Vehicle fuel, maintenance, insurance, WorkSafe PC, which would be a small incremental cost, and then a bunch of other items, not to mention the transition costs that would be incurred in there as well. Then really we're not dealing with a lot of difference in the costs of the different models. And what I've suggested is its cost, it could be slightly higher, it could be slightly lower, depending on the specific assumptions we put in, but it's probably not enough of a factor to make that the determining factor as to whether it stays out of house or comes in house, in my view, and if I can suggest that. We looked also at flexibility, which is another consideration we might want to add into the mix in determining whether to keep it out of house or bring it in house. And what I suggested here is when we look around at other places, we see that in fact both models can be very flexible. Arguably, you may find some increased flexibility on the contract out service because you've got, for example, quite a bit of time kind of brought in after hours. You've also got, right now in the NIMOS case, you've got a dwelling at the Pound and Adoption Center that is occupied by the chief pound operator there, so that person's kind of on call there 24/7. So that flexibility, it may be something that you would cost you a little bit more inside the if it were in the city, but that is something that would need to be looked at. Degree of control. Right now, the city exercises control through the terms of a service agreement with the private company. If the city wanted, and that's fine, and most cities find that to be quite acceptable. Some cities want to have more control over the day-to-day operations and the decisions that are made on a day-to-day basis. What I've suggested is that cities that do require or desire that day-to-day control typically want to bring that in-house. So if that's something that's important to the city, if that's the most important thing to the city, that would lead you towards a decision to bring it in-house. I'm not suggesting that is, by the way, the most important thing. I think that the city probably is able to exercise enough control through the service contract, but that's something for council to consider. And finally, and other local governments, the second to last point here, so what others are doing, well, really there's no consensus here. We've got some cases, larger places in the GVRD area, in the Metro Vancouver area, tend to do it in-house. There are some exceptions. Mid-sized places, particularly on Vancouver Island, tend to do it by contract. Central Okanagan, as one regional district that provides the service region-wide, does it in-house. Other regional districts contract it out. So there's really no consensus with respect to a model that is preferable to local governments, looking at the experience of other places. And finally, I'll just note, with city's experience, there are always going to be issues with every service, irrespective as to whether it's delivered in-house or out-of-house. Animal control of the city right now is no exception to that point. On the whole, however, when we take into account the people interviewed, the stakeholders, not only city staff, but others as well, there does seem to be support for the current model, the contract model. And I will mention, and I think staff will corroborate this, that the current service provider, delivery agency in particular, seems to be performing very well for the city on that. And so I think that the city's experience has been one of relative satisfaction, quite high satisfaction, I would suggest. So my point in saying all these things, Your Worship, is to say that the city could easily do it inside, could bring it in-house, could easily keep it out of house. It is currently out of house. There doesn't seem to be a compelling reason to change from that direction right now and to reconsider whether it should be a new contract. In other words, there doesn't seem to be a compelling reason to change from the contract out model. I'll move ahead, Your Worship, if there are no questions.
I have a question from Councillor Gesselbrock, or Councillor Armstrong first, and then Councillor Gesselbrock.
I'm actually have two, Your Worship. One might have to go to either our CEO or city clerk. If we were to go with the contract, can we renew it, or should we have to go to RFP based on charter?
Ms. Curry.
Thank you, Your Worship. So I don't think it's so much of a charter question as it is a purchasing policy question. So I think that if I could get finance staff in here to answer that, but I believe it's based on a purchasing policy, so I could get that information and get back to you.
Yeah, that would be good. And then my second question is, if we do the contract out, is it possible that the person that has the contract could look after the dead animal pickup instead of our public works people if we're going to do that?
Right now they do.
Yeah, but no, the recommendation was to put it over to public works, so that's my question.
Instead of having
them do that.
So the question is really whether it's any savings or value.
Yeah, thank you. That makes it better for me. Thank you.
Councillor Gesselbrock, and then Councillor Bonner.
Thank you, Worship. My questions are just like, it doesn't sound like there's a compelling reason cost-wise to go in-house or out. or for the flexibility or for the control. I guess my question is that one, like I know a lot of our bylaw officers have worked for animal control, and I'm just curious if we're, with it outside, are we losing people that when they get experience and that with animal control, then they move over to the city for more job security and that, and I guess like that would be the trade-off. Is there having to renew a contract every 3 years, does that just make it less of a stable situation for the workers there, and then not attracting, and keeping that, level of quality and capacity growing? Was that identified as a potential consideration?
Thank you, Your Worship. If I may, through to the councillor, that's a very good point. I did not look at that. I think that it is, you're absolutely right. I think that it goes without saying that moving over to the city would not only provide a little more job security, but also provide kind of other benefits such as useful pension and so forth. I think that it may provide kind of more secure. Whether it would provide kind of a higher level of expertise or experience, I don't know. Again, when we look at other places, there is quite a bit of contracting out in this area of service. So I think there are some very good companies out there. I would suggest that Nanaimo Animal Control is one of those, and they do tend to have very little turnover on some of their key staff at least. So they have had, for reasons, they provide the service, for example, in the city of Victoria as well, and done that for many years. So, but it is something. It is a valid consideration for sure. If that's something that's important to council, to provide that job security and to ensure that there is that kind of corporate message or that corporate memory, if you will.
The other question is just in terms of integration between city and for services. I think it's my understanding that on the dog tags, it's the city financial number for financial services. Is that correct?
The city financial services does kind of manage the dog licensing, yes.
Because I'm just like, most people, if they find a dog or whatever, that's the number they call, and I'm wondering if our financial service staff are getting calls about animal control issues when the number that possibly could be on that tag would be for the actual animal control folks, especially if it's a Saturday or whatnot, and if having an outhouse service just creates those integration problems as well. Yeah.
That's a really very interesting question. I did not that didn't arise as an issue in the interviews and the research, but I will make a note of that and look into that a little further.
I've got one more question.
One more whiff.
Just also too, in terms of the integration with the regional district animal control. My understanding that dogs picked up in Cedar or whatever end up going down to Duncan, to the pound down there, and I was just wondering if there was any opportunities if we did an in-house model that we could provide and maybe create some revenue for the city by providing services to the regional district, or just any opportunities around that.
I think that there could be some medium and longer term opportunities. The region right now is in a contract with a private carrier on that. And I will mention as well that the region does have a very basic service compared to that of the city. So there would have to be some discussion around whether there was a common vision on how the groups wanted to kind of approach, I guess, the animal control. I mean, ideally, maybe what would even be preferable is if there were one sub-regional service either provided or delivered by the city or by the region to the whole kind of Nanaimo area. But that would require a big change in kind of the philosophy around animal control that currently exists outside of the city's boundaries. But I think that there is the potential, I suppose, that I wouldn't say no, of having the region kind of, or having the city make some revenue from animals in the region. But I'd have to look at that a little more carefully just to see what kind of numbers would be involved, and also look at the current dates of the service that the regional district has in place, with the service contractors, excuse me.
Great, thank you.
Before I go to Councillor Bonner and then Councillor Armstrong, Ms. Gurry, you have some?
Yes, so I just did receive some follow-up from finance. I'm waiting for part 2 of the question. But yes, our purchasing policy does require it go to RFP. And then I'm just waiting to find out if the contract could be for 5 years.
That's what I was
Finance
gonna say.
believes it could be for a 5-year term, but they're just going to let me know.
Thank you. Councillor Bonner?
Thank you, Worship. Question, actually, one quick question to staff of mine is there any set price to managing a contract? Like doing the RFP, creating all the documents, all that sort of stuff. Is that something you would consider overall as opposed to an in-house model? Is there much savings there?
So the question you're through is the administration of establishing the model.
The contract.
And then we do actually process the dog tags, and so there is still some burden on the municipality. I guess that could be, we could do some math on that here. I guess if we wanted to unpack that a bit. I mean, it's again, it gets into the general thrust of what Mr. Nielsen is suggesting, is that even if we added the 22,000 with the SPCA permissive tax exemption and those types of things, the relative realm of costs is comparable to other jurisdictions. And in this case, he's suggesting that the cost and benefits of in-house or out-of-house in terms of those specific numbers is relatively the same when you get into the intangibles. I was going to say, though, that Mr. LaBerge is here. It's because it's a city position doesn't mean that we're going to be able to keep those people, because there's, my observation by a lot of departments everywhere is that there's high turnover because it's becoming an increasingly difficult realm to work in. And so I'm not sure that would necessarily guarantee longevity of service for those employees. They may not want it, to be honest.
And if to Mr. Nielsen, if I may, thank you. When you talk about flexibility, you mainly refer to the flexibility of the out-of-house option in terms of their abilities. Could we also look at the possibility of flexibility of employment? If it's in-house, there's a lot more employees to draw on in the event that somebody's away or there's a pandemic, something happening. Maybe possibly looking at that, and in your final report, if it's possible, I wouldn't mind seeing the cost of the infrastructure to set it up in-house. I don't know if you plan on doing that or not. If we buy all the equipment.
Sure. Okay, thank you very much. Your Worship, I wonder, I don't know if you can see, but I know Councillor Turley's been waving his hand there, and I wanted to get in on the questions as well.
I'm glad you can see Councillor Turley, because I can't, and we'll certainly allow Councillor Turley to answer your question. Thank you.
Okay.
Am I next then?
Yeah, always.
Okay, so yeah, I've had my raised hand up for over half an hour, and every now and then, thank you, Al, for spotting me.
Just so you know, you weren't being ignored deliberately by council or staff. Sorry.
Okay, fair enough. Okay. I get over these things quite easily. I have 2 questions, actually. Number one goes back to getting the word out. And my question is probably to Your Worship, to staff, and perhaps Mr. Nielsen might have an answer. Do we provide information to agencies such as Welcome Wagon and the realtors when they're dealing with new people arriving in the community that, yes, they do have to get a dog license?
Welcome Wagon's gone.
Did you hear me?
Yeah, I think I heard someone say in the audience there that the Welcome Wagon doesn't exist anymore. Is that the case?
That's true. They declared bankruptcy about 2 weeks ago.
Okay. Well, I know the realtors have it, so what about them?
Yeah, real estate's moving. and screening.
I'm not aware, I didn't come across that, Councillor Turley, in my research, unless staff knows differently. But that's a very good, your point I think is very well taken, is that's a natural place, certainly to get people coming to town. It doesn't kind of deal with the folks that are already in town choosing not to, but people coming to town for sure, yes.
Okay, thank you. And the next one is to do with collection of fines. You know, I always have a concern when people deliberately don't pay what's due, what repercussions there are. And are these fines, or can they be added to their tax bill? Or is it just, hopefully they'll pay one day?
I believe, and maybe Mr. LaBerge can kind of comment on this as well, but I understand that they can be added to their tax bill through bylaw events notices, but I stand to be corrected there.
He says no, they can't.
He says no, Mr. Nielsen, and Ms. Gurry's not disagreeing with Mr. LaBerge.
Okay, well, I'm glad I kept a caveat in there. So,
Well, we could not pick up their garbage a couple weeks in a row.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Bonner, you're finished?
I'm done, thank you.
Councillor Armstrong?
My point was just I
Point
asked
taken.
Ms. Gurry to check to see if we could do a 5-year contract instead of 3, based on what Councillor Hazelberg said about job security.
Councillor Gesselbrock.
Great, thank you. Just one more comment and question in terms of the decision between in-house and a contract out model. I mean, there is a large number of dogs and cats in the community, and one of the recommendations further on is just increased education and messaging and around dog licensing and a whole bunch of other measures. And I'm just curious if consistent branding, is that an issue with branding and messaging, having an animal control outfit that's not city and then all this information and messaging going out? Is that a consideration that we need to be thinking about, or is it not a non-issue?
I think, again, that's another very good point to kind of look at. It is certainly possible. Well, let me put it this way. Right now, the material that is put out, that is given out to people in parks, is produced by Nanaimo Animal Control. It would be, in my mind, preferable to have that produced by the city and simply have Animal Control give out then what the city has to them to give out, what the city provides. So I think you could have a system whereby the city provided or took the lead even on some messaging, or at least provided the messaging to go out there, and also everything is on the city website too. But would you have more control over messaging if it were in-house? I would suggest you would. And the same, if we consider the messaging kind of falls under a day-to-day decision, or kind of a shorter-term decision that is kind of implemented and changes quite frequently depending on the audience and depending on the opportunity and the issue at hand. So that maybe goes back a little bit to kind of the desire for control. If it's something that council wants the city to kind of have more control over, then that is something that would lean toward more an in-house model. If it's something that we think we can kind of get through some templates, through some design guidelines and so forth, ensure that there is consistency in branding, and use the contractor to do that, then that would be an option there, I suppose.
Thank you. Yeah, just as a comment, I think animal issues, just given population growth and increased density, are only going to become a greater consideration. And so I think preemptively, the more organized and integrated our services and communications are, the better. And so just as in the report, considerations for if we are considering to go to an in-house or a contract service model. Thank you.
Ms. Curry.
Excellent.
Thank you, Your Worship. So just I wanted to let Council know, and Mr. LaBerge knows this as well, as this is the service delivery discussion and developing a contract or getting that in place, and then coming from that will be a bylaw revision based on the new contract, having the contract in place or the service delivery model in place first, helps the bylaw to be more accurate and reflect what you as a council actually would like. And through that process, Ms. Robertson, the Deputy City Clerk, has gone through it a couple times in a couple different municipalities. There'll be tons of engagement and education, and basically gets to the point where hopefully everybody is 100% community and council behind this bylaw when you all adopt it, coming from this service delivery. So there will be a lot of that, Council Kesselbrock, and some advertising and education city-based because of the bylaw being the city's.
Please proceed, Mr. Nielsen. We have a few more paws to put in this puppy yet.
Okay. Thank you, Worship. So level of staffing, I will just mention when we look at an issue, so we've got right now 2.33 or 2 1/3 full-time equivalent animal control officers. So we've got 2 full-time officers, and then we've got 1 part-time officer who joins us for 4 months of the summer. And when I say we, these of course are contracted staff, but the city contract provides funding for this level of service. So that's the key point there. There is also funding provided for 2.5 full-time equivalents of pound and adoption centers. So we've got kind of 1 full-time kind of administrator of the pound. We've got 1 full-time pound or kennel worker, and then we've got a part-time person as well to provide coverage and to assist on different aspects. We then also have the manager of the animal control, who also, when he is in town 2 days a week, because he splits his time between Victoria and Nanaimo, it acts as a senior animal control officer and provides some additional capacity there. When we look at considerations, I should mention that the reason that level of staffing came up as a consideration is I guess the impetus for that, I would say, is that the funding provided for level of service, so the de facto level of service or level of staffing that comes under the contract has not changed for about 40 years. So, since 1986, I think. So, of course, the city has changed quite a bit in that time. So, while that in and of itself may not say we need more staffing, may not lead to that conclusion, it does kind of beg the question as to whether we should look at staffing adjustments. And when we say staffing adjustments, again, providing more through the service, more funding through the service to provide for more staffing and to identify that in any contract if, in fact, council decides to keep the service out of the house. So when we look at a level of staffing, then what are the considerations that we would want to make in determining whether we've got sufficient staff or need additional staff? Well, the first one really is to look at other jurisdictions. What do the experiences in other jurisdictions tell us? What do the levels tell us? And unfortunately, as we go through the reasoning on this, we look at other places, we see that it's inherently difficult to compare because we've got such different models in different places. I've just kind of touched on some of the differences, I guess, some of the inherent challenges, I guess. So when we look at kind of the responsibilities assigned to staff, so the breadth of service can change and does change in different places. When we look at kind of the inability or the ability to rely on other departments to deal with specific tasks, so we look at our deceased animals, for example, and the use of public works. When we look at the size of the service area and just the amount of windshield time that staff have to spend kind of traveling across that whatever that size of service area is, I think Councillor Turvey's degree of urban development in the city and moving from kind of single-family focus to multi-family focus, which gets people more into parks, which gets animals more into parks, and kind of gets us in the situation then of having more human-animal interactions, which inevitably leads to more conflicts or the potential for more conflicts. All these different things can lead to difficulties in comparing different levels of staffing. We then also and just to kind of give a few examples, looking at some of these different challenges, the city of Kamloops, very similar to Nanaimo in terms of geography, in terms of population, and so forth, but and a few differences in terms of statistics when it comes to animal control, but there we've got a different system whereby animal control is delivered by law enforcement officers as part of their task, and we've got a staff of over 10 by law enforcement officers, so it's hard to kind of determine kind of where they're spending all of their time because it's very fluid. When we look at our DC CO, Central Okanagan. We've got 7 different animal control officers, but we've got a much different kind of role for those officers, a focus only on dogs, and we've also got assistance by dog ambassadors. I'll come to that in a moment when we talk about pet ambassadors in the Nanaimo context. When we look at Victoria, we've got a much different kind of setting than Nanaimo, and they've got 4 ACOs there. So then when we look at, so it's much more compact, much more urban, but then they're going to be dealing with slightly different issues than Nanaimo is. And then we look at Nanaimo, or I beg your pardon, Saanich, and at Saanich we've got kind of fewer staff, but there are no call-outs after hours. Those staff are only there for business hours. All issues that occur after hours are handled by the Saanich Police. So we've got kind of all these different agencies kind of dealing with the service in different ways. So it's very difficult to kind of look across those departments and those different departments and identify what an appropriate level of service is. So we look at other factors. Well, what staff are expected to do, and this relates back to the scope of service. I have established through kind of my interviews I've had, not only with the Animal Control, of course, but with others in the community, city staff, SPCA, other stakeholders, that and Parks Department as well, kind of, they're a key client, if you will, of animal control. So it is difficult currently for animal control to kind of provide a good level of service at all times, particularly in the summer, even with extra staffing assigned in the summer. So we do have coverage issues during periods of staff absences as well, which is an issue. Parks managers have kind of confirmed that dog issues are on the increase in the summer, and that's again in spite of extra staff. And then we have also our broad scope, which includes our deceased animals and so forth, which kind of take away again from the capacity of animal control also to deal with animal control issues. So we've got a number of different kind of, if we look at what staff are expected to do and how many staff there are, we've got some kind of pressure points there. The changing nature of Nanaimo, again, back to Councillor Turley's point, we've got a growing urban community, we've got a greater number of dogs because we've got more people coming, and we know that the dogs are kind of, the growth in dog population is directly correlated to growth in human population. We know that through lots of the studies that have been done. We've got more residents using local parks, particularly because we have fewer single-family homes compared to multifamily going in. Right now, we still have, of course, a lot of single-family homes, but new development is now tilted towards multifamily homes, and so people then rely more on parks to recreate and to exercise their animals. We do know that there are more abandoned animals because we know as population increases, we do have more abandoned animals, particularly cats. Dogs don't seem to be abandoned, cats do. I mentioned earlier that when we kind of grow, as we grow more densely and so forth, we do get more people and animals coming into contact, and that's when we tend to see from other places that have larger services and larger service populations in areas, that's when we tend to see issues occur, when we need animal control officers. So that's something to kind of consider as well. And then finally, the financial realities. It is a cost service. It does cost the city. It's not a city that you're going to break even on. It's not a service, excuse me, you're likely going to break even on. And of course, as council knows, we are kind of coming out of pandemic now, and so there are some significant financial realities in the immediate term and perhaps in the next budget year as well that are going to dictate for council perhaps a little bit of what it does with respect to staffing levels and different services. What I suggested in the report, Your Worship, is that council consider providing in any new contract resources for one additional ACO group, so one additional full-time equivalent animal control officer. I know that there are many people in Nanaimo, certainly in kind of the animal welfare and animal control environments or kind of communities that would like many more than that. But I think that one is sufficient for what he's trying to achieve here. And but part and parcel of that is looking at the scope of service on moving that deceased animals from animal control to public works. Your Worship, there were two issues I talked about earlier that the city did want to address in particular in this service review, in addition to the other broader issues that we've talked about, or the broader scope of issues we talked about. And we talked earlier about kind of the service delivery model, and the second issue is the Pound and Adoption Center. What to do with the Pound and Adoption Center. As Mr. Lindsay mentioned in his introductory comments, this facility is quite old. It was actually built and opened in 1977, and it really hasn't been updated since. There have been a few changes, cosmetic changes mostly, a few bits and pieces here, but nothing really significant or to mention since that time. It does sit on land owned by the city, big Parks, Recreation and Culture Works Yard, Nanaimo Lakes Road in South Nanaimo. That's not an inappropriate site. We tend to like to have pounds because they can be very noisy, either in industrial areas or remote areas, so this one certainly fits that criteria, the remote area criteria. When we look at the building itself, anybody who walks through the building will be impressed with how incredibly clean and tidy and organized it is, but those kinds of attributes do mask a little bit some of the structural inefficiencies and difficulties and challenges that lie underneath that nice exterior, that nice kind of sense of order. So the city had done had looked at a couple of different options, and the first was to, I think, well, maybe I'll back up a half step, Your Worship, and just say that the city, I believe, if I can presume to say, has kind of accepted that something needs to be done with this facility or with the idea of providing a pound service. So there are three different options really that kind of rise to the surface. The first is to look at the existing facility and to renovate it extensively. And on that note, the city did in 2017 have a building condition assessment report undertaken by a group called Spacecraft Design Corp. And they looked at the facility from a couple of different perspectives. Where they looked, first of all, to provide an assessment of the condition of the building. They looked to review the deficiencies that the contractor at the time had pointed out to the city. They looked, very importantly, to kind of examine the industry standards, which are set out by the Canadian Standards of Care in Animal Shelters. And that's a document that comes out originally of this week. It's been adapted for Canadian use as well. And it is kind of the Bible, as it were, in the animal care community in terms of how to provide shelters that meet basic standards of care, of animal care. As you can imagine, those standards have changed since 1977. We're a little more aware now than we used to be in the days of the dog catcher with the dog net and kind of thrown in the pound. So one of the things then that coming out of the report, the key thing that the city asked for was for the contractor to provide an order of magnitude cost to renovate the facility, bring it up to speed with those animal care standards. Long story short, the contractor did come up with a cost of $214,000. That's a couple of years old now. That is a starting point cost. It doesn't take into account some other studies that the contractor has identified, including structural engineering studies that would need to be looked at. But we're looking as a starting point at about $250,000, say $214 in 2017 dollars. So that would be the extensively renovating option to kind of bring the current facility up to what would need to be the bare minimum. Another option then is to build a new facility, and this is something that the city could do on its existing site, either in the current building footprint or adjacent to the current footprint. The SPCA branch, towards which the city contributed $50,000 in capital a couple of years ago, costs $3.4 million. That's about twice the size of the current city facility. That's actually quite a good price, because when we looked at a facility that is now being looked at or undertaken in the city of Richmond, just across the water there, we've got a situation where they looked at three different options for a new facility that would be kind of state-of-the-art animal care standards, provide adoption facility, provide education rooms, those kinds of things. And their quotes or their estimates came from for a building that would be the same size as the current Nanaimo Center of $8 million, up to one that would be twice the size of $13 million. So even at the SPCA building of $3.5 million, quite a bit more than the renovate option. The third option then would be to partner with an existing shelter. The difficulty difficulty in Nanaimo is that we've got one existing shelter that really could kind of meet the criteria associated with animal control, and that would be the SPCA one. The SPCA has pretty emphatically said they're not interested for two reasons. One is because they're getting out of the business. It doesn't kind of match their philosophy or their kind of mission as an agency that is kind of dedicated to the welfare of animals. So it's not something that is within their focus. And the second is, even if it were something they would be interested in doing, the current facility is already exceeded its capacity, so there's just no room to accommodate anything from the city. So what we suggested here is that the most logical option for the city to consider at this point would be to look at the renovation option. Your Worship, I'll move ahead if I could, because I know we're moving on and I know you've got other things on the agenda. Cats in Nanaimo. Most places, or many places I should say, although Vancouver Island seems to be a bit of an exception, and there are other places looking at this now, but a lot of places don't really want to get into cats because of the, well, we have, adages such as herding cats, for example. It's very difficult. However, sometimes there is an issue to be dealt with, and that seems to be the case in Nanaimo as it does increasingly in other communities. We see that on Vancouver Island. We see it also in Alberta, where cats seem to be a growing focus of animal control services. When we look at cats, we start, first of all, to kind of look at a typology or some language around this. The first is to consider stray cats. Stray cats are household pets that are lost or have been abandoned by their owners. Comfortable around humans, can be adopted out, and so forth. So that's the first thing. Surrendered cats are surrendered cats that have been given up to animal welfare agencies such as the SPCA by their owners for whatever reason. They're unable to care for them. Feral cats are cats that have never had any contact with humans or that have not had any recent contact with humans and are not socialized. These cats can't be adopted out, they can't be housed, they are wild cats. Okay, right now in our existing service, we mention cats in our bylaw, but we have a very limited role with respect to cats. We, like other places, have tried to stay away from dealing with cats, controlling cats. We do have one section which simply requires pet owners to isolate any cats that have been suffering from infectious or contagious diseases. Other than that, we don't have anything in there with respect to cats. We do at the Poundin Adoption Center, we do have some facility in there to deal with cats, but it's very limited. It's very ill-suited to cats. It's kind of a makeshift of different kennels in different parts of the building, including the staff kitchen, including the laundry room. Wherever they can fit a cat, basically, and be sure that that cat's not going to spread infection, we'll try to put it in there. After 72 hours, the contractor on behalf of the city legally owns that animal and it can't be adopted out. Those cats are adopted out then. The monies from the adoption go back to the contractor who provides a spay and neutering program using the revenues from the adoptions. So we have very limited capacity, as I mentioned, in the current pound. The pound is operated like every other animal care facility is under kind of a capacity for care model. So it's hard to say what the capacity is because it's whatever they're able to care for safely at the time. So if there are some infectious cats in there, the overall capacity will go down. If it's only feral cats, it will go down. If there are other cats, it will go up, that kind of idea. Now, when we look at Nanaimo, we need to look at kind of in the cats in Nanaimo, we need to look at two different agencies as well. The first is SPCA, of course. SPCA adopts out cats. It takes in about 700 cats a year from Nanaimo and its surrounding areas. So that's not just the city of Nanaimo, but a lot from the city of Nanaimo. Wherever possible, stray cats are transferred to the city's pound, so the city really focuses on stray cats. Feral cats are transferred to Catnap Society. That society deals with feral cats. SPCA tries to focus on surrendered cats, that is cats that can't be cared for that are sent to the SPCA. With 700 cats and with very limited ability of the city to take cats, you can guess that SPCA does actually keep a lot of stray cats and will end up adopting those out as well. When we look at Catnap, we talked earlier about their trap, neuter, release program. So that's very important to kind of talk about because it is a service that provides a bit of a bulwark for the city when it comes to feral cat populations because they are important, and we'll get into that just in a moment here. So, cat-related issues. The first, we talked about the lack of provisions to promote responsible cat ownership, so we don't have a lot of bylaw changes in there right now, and that's something that we may wish to consider. So bylaw changes. So, bigger part there. I've suggested 3 bylaw changes in here for council to deal with, and this would address some of the challenges that we're seeing with cats in Nanaimo right now. The first is to require identification for cats, and the clerk talked about Ms. Robertson, your deputy clerk, who was involved in cat-related or animal-related bylaws in other jurisdictions, and so most recently in North Cowichan and in Duncan, they included a requirement in their bylaws that owners must attach identification to their cats. That can be permanent in the form of microchips or tattoos, or it can be in the form of some kind of well-affixed non-permanent license, or not license, excuse me, but identifier. Another change to consider then is to require all cats that are allowed outside to be spayed and neutered. Cats are very susceptible to overpopulation. They breed like cats, frankly. So, if I haven't done nothing on cats, I'll tell you. So the other requirement then is to ensure that all cats that are allowed outside are spayed and neutered. And then a third change, which is not in Duncan and North Cowichan bylaw, but has been recommended by SPCA and is also in Victoria and the Esquimalt and Oak Bay bylaws, is a prohibition of cats at large. Now, that's very difficult to enforce, but it is an additional tool that animal control officers find useful to have. So we've identified 3 different bylaw changes to consider to promote responsible pet ownership among cat owners. We have not included, by the way, the requirement for cat licensing. That is something that does come up in the SPCA bylaw. They have a kind of a model bylaw for municipalities that they suggest. It is also something that is very popular in Alberta. We have not suggested that here. It's not something that's well supported even in cat literature, or not universally supported, and it's something that is very difficult for municipalities to get into. So I've suggested here that we leave that out for now, and probably for some time.
Councillor Gesselbrock has a question.
I'm just curious about the cat licensing. It's incredibly unpopular.
It is. Yeah, it is very unpopular. Yeah, exactly. I think but the introduction of a new requirement that tends to be unpopular in cat licensing is no different. The other thing, too, to remember is, and the SPCA makes this point, that ideally every cat is a house cat. Cats, responsible. If we're dogmatic about it, no pun intended, cat owners will keep their cats inside. So in those cases, you would not need a license, and there'd be a lot of pushback from cat owners who, in fact, do, and there are many of them, keep their cats inside.
So the benefits of the licensing, you'd get more bang out of your buck just with the prohibition of cats at large.
You would. I think a lot of people will do the benefits of licensing, or I shouldn't say a lot of people, there's very few places do it. Certainly in BC, I don't know of any place that does it, but in Alberta, places do it, and in those places, they'll often do it for 2 reasons. One, kind of as a form of, kind of using the equity argument that, well, if we require dog owners to do it, we should also require cat owners. And then the other is that it increases revenues for the service. And I guess the third would be it allows them to track numbers a little better.
Well, just to follow up on that, I mean, if we're having to expend money on maybe potentially having grants for the catnap program, if there's bylaw officer time being spent on cats, and if you factor in the ecological disaster of bird population decimation by cats, like I think that probably having people spend a little bit of money on a license is very well within the realm of being reasonable.
It's a good argument. It's I can't deny that. It's something that the council certainly can consider. I think in the paper I suggested kind of to deal with the first 3 changes and then revisit that a bit later. But it's a persuasive argument.
Sounds like
campaign slogan.
Yeah, there's more birds down by cats.
Do carry on, Mr. Nielsen. We've been running this one a long time. It's no criticism, lots of questions from council. It's not a criticism.
Okay, thank you, sir. Pounded Adoption Center, what we have suggested, or what I've suggested the Pounded Adoption Center is that the city follow through with the changes that were identified by Spacecraft, the design group that had done the work for the city. In their reports in the city, they had identified transitioning a portion of the existing kennel into a cat wing. And they've got in there some very flexible rooming that would allow the city to properly care for the cats that it brings in now. It won't significantly increase the capacity, and that's not a bad thing necessarily. It will increase it a little bit, which is good, but it will kind of bring up the standard of care for cats that do end up in town, which is good. And it will also ensure that any infected cats are kept physically separate from other cats that are in there, which is good. And then finally, I do think that there is a case to be made for support for efforts to control feral cats. In the document, there's a number there's quite a bit of information here about feral cats and some of the issues that affect the city. The bird population has been one. The overpopulation is very difficult with feral cats. In fact, some of the numbers would just blow your mind in terms of what these cats are capable of producing through reproduction. It's quite something. But also then from a public health perspective, and I cited in the paper a 1995 study, a scientific study that had been done around potential contamination of drinking water in the CRD watershed that was attributed to feral cat populations, or at least in part to feral cat populations. So what I've tried to kind of state through this part of the paper, Your Worship, is simply that feral cats are an issue in Nanaimo, not only in Nanaimo, outside of Nanaimo as well, but right on the borders of Nanaimo. We look at the trap data that the police report like that. Feral cats are an issue. You've got a bit of an overtaxed and not terribly sustainable volunteer group right now that is doing the work on that. It is when we talk to stakeholders, the SPCA, city staff, animal control officers, when we do the research and look up and down Vancouver Broad and outside, we see that feral cat populations have the potential to become major problems for the city. My suggestion here is that you've got an agency that with a little bit of support, their granting aid could become more sustainable and could save the city from potential major headaches a little bit later on. Because this issue is probably not going away. It will ebb and flow, but it's probably not going away, and they're doing a very good job of controlling that now and ensuring that not only are cats cared for, but perhaps even more importantly, the population is kept in check. Very briefly, we talked about education earlier. We talked about kind of the information program. It's all in the report. I know we're running out of time here. Pet ambassadors, I've identified this in here as something for the city to consider. This program, by the way, may go back to the question that was asked earlier about some kind of control over messaging and the information that goes out. By having a couple of students every summer work, and a couple of university students work as pet ambassadors in city parks, in high-traffic city parks, giving out information, giving pats on the back to responsible pet owners, gently persuading other pet owners to kind of do the right thing. They're not enforcement officers. They don't give warnings. They don't give tickets. It's a very kind of positive community service that is providing information service. That may help to kind of give the city more control over what kind of information is given out, because these pet ambassadors would very much be in control of that, or be kind of the conduits for which the city reach a lot of both current and prospective pet owners and license holders. And I mentioned it's a very cost-efficient program, cost-effective program. In the RDCO now, which has been doing it for several years, they use Service Canada summer grants every year, so the cost is very minor to the city. Finally, Your Worship, there are a number of suggestions provided with respect to the bylaw. I won't bother going through them. They kind of just simply capture a lot of the changes that have been suggested thus far. And then we talk about recommendations. They're there for dog licensing, scope of service, delivery model, level of service, Pound and Adoption Center, Cats and Nanaimo Education, and bylaw changes. They're all there beginning in Chapter 4 on page 40 of the report, Your Worship. If the council wishes, I'm happy to go through some of them and explain them, but I'll just leave them there until last otherwise. I'll stop there, Your Worship.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nielsen. I'm not seeing any more questions. You've been subject to vigorous cross-examination, but Councillor Bonner never fails to disappoint me, so
I just wanted to mention that we get a fair amount of emails on animals and cats and dogs and stuff like that, but we've never had any complaints about our current system and how it's working. And I think that's a testimonial to the professionalism of the animal control officers we have here in town. So kudos to them. If anybody's keeping score, bad puns on animals, it's Alan 5 and then letter 3.
Good report.
isn't it nice to know you're getting the attention you wanted to have? Thank you very much. I do appreciate this. Obviously, we're not looking for any motion today. This is a first kick at the... Oh, God, I can't say it. I won't say it. A first review... Oh, Councillor Gesselbrock.
Yeah, no, I think this is quite an important topic and thing to consider, and I'm just curious, just a question to staff is sort of like, what is the next steps in the process of these recommendations and the bylaws and decision points?
Mr. Lindsay's going to respond.
Thank you, Worship. It's summarized on page 2 of the staff report, but in general, 3 things. So we need to come forward and get council's final decision before we go out with the new contract. So we plan to do that before the end of August. Come back to you on that decision point. Then there'll be subsequent decision points about investment, which will come out as part of your deliberations for the 2021 budget. And then we need to come back to you with the new animal control. So those are the three items that I expect to be back for our council this year.
Councillor Martin.
Through you, Your Worship. So if because the contract's coming up the end of August this year, so that's like 2 months. Do we need to, it sounds like we need to put out a request for a proposal. We can't just renew the contract. What is timing usually like for an RFP?
I think we still have time. Obviously, it's getting, so we need to get back to council. This is obviously the first step. We need to get back to council and make that final decision. If we proceed, we do need to go for an RFP. So we've done, the current contract is 3 years and there's a 2-year extension. That's now coming to an end. So we will need to go and do an RFP. We may end up in a case where we do a minor extension for the new agreement. That'll be our first order of business and our first priority is
So, if I may, so I would imagine that one is the delivery model and whether or not we renew the contract or an RFP, etc. And then the separate issue would be the building itself.
That's correct. And Your Worship, as Mr. Nielsen mentioned, there was quite a fulsome review done, and we actually had those items ready to include in the 2020 budget. But we thought it would be good to take a moment and step back and do a service review overall before we committed those funds to that building. So if council makes the decision to maintain with an external contract, and we would likely be following up in 2021 with improvements to the building that was anticipated to start this year. So we'll go ahead in 2021 if that's the road that council thinks.
Thank you.
Councillor Armstrong, then Councillor Gesselbrock.
But for me, I'm quite prepared to make a decision today based on everything we got. I don't know why we need to wait unless others feel differently.
I think given the way this report has been prepared in light of all the circumstances, I'm going to let Mr. Rudolph go before Councillor Gesselbrock.
Just for process-wise, Your Worship, I think, well, firstly, this is a council meeting, so you can make a decision, but we haven't fashioned up a motion for you. But Mr. Lindsley has basically indicated that we'd be coming back with unless we hear otherwise, report going to RFP with perhaps some modifications to that service contract for your review. So that would be the next step unless we hear otherwise. And And that'll be, and then the second phase would be the budget, which would be submitted to you this fall, which would be the capital side for this building. Even if it was in-house or not, you'd still need to have a facility. And as was indicated, it was in this year's capital and it got pushed off to do the service review. The third piece would be a follow-up, tidying up with the bylaw. We might have to do that in conjunction, at least some of it. So I think you probably could get a report to council pretty in short order with respect to the option of going forward with an RFP. Even if you got that back, you could still have the chance of not accepting that. So I suspect otherwise we'll be in a month to month. So yes, you can make a motion today in any of those things, but otherwise we would come back hopefully in July.
I think we've tentatively earmarked the first council meeting in July, which I think is July the 6th.
Yeah, that's
I appreciate your enthusiasm, Councillor Armstrong, but I think I'm hearing a broad hint and one with which I concur that we should probably wait for the report to come back and for us to give consideration to this. Councillor Gesselbrock.
Just in terms of there was a substantial set of recommendations that would change the service agreement a little bit. I think that the report was excellent and these recommendations should be actioned. Is staff going to take these recommendations and integrate that into the service agreement RFP that would be going out, or what is council's role in terms of moving forward on the recommendations?
Your Worship, I think the idea, of course, was when this was originally fashioned as a GPC, was to allow what exactly happened today, kind of introduce the topic of the council, allow for that debate. We could have just taken the recommendations and thrown it in the council report, but I think we benefited from having this larger discussion today. So yes, we will be taking those recommendations, and that will form the basis of the report on July the 6th.
Okay, cool.
This is just a draft report. That's the best way to put it. Ms. Gurry.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just had a message from staff that you're hard to hear, Dale, so I don't know if you want to speak a little louder. Apparently the jacket's loud, but your voice is
I love the jacket.
awesome. Me too. That wasn't me.
Can HR hear me right now? I'd like to find out.
We can hear you now, just maybe need to go up.
That was Richard. Gotta go, Richard.
If that concludes things, we are running a bit past time. I want to thank Mr. Lindsay and Mr. Nielsen for all their work today and council for their questions. I think it's helped guide the further draft of the report that we will see in due course. We're shooting for July. I think everyone's got some hints as to where some people would like to go with this, but I think we need to give this the deliberation it deserves. So if I don't hear from anyone else, I'm going to say thank you once again. We are running behind, and the next is the Manual of Engineering Standards and Specifications Revision Update. Mr. Sims, please.
I know.
Rose's going to do it. I wonder if you want to borrow Mr. Lindsay's jacket so we can hear you.
Oh, poor Dale.
Oh, Dale, it was Mr. Harding, not me.
Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah. You never kick a dead dog, Mr. Lindsay.
Good afternoon, Your Worship, Council. The next item on the agenda is the Manual of Engineering Standards and Specifications. As Council is aware, there is an ongoing process to update the engineering standards that's been going on for a couple of years now. It's a pretty substantial update. It includes a major overhaul of the transportation section, which is quite out of date. It's more than a decade out of date. It's really intended to bring it up to sort of current best practices, meet community expectations and all that, but it is a very substantial change. We have done a lot of engagement with the community, with developers, with engineers, with contractors and so on through the whole entire process. We've had more than 40 instances of engagement, but it's come to light that there's a bit of concern within the land development business community. So we're in the process of setting up a round table to talk to them, try and understand what their concerns are, see if we can find some common ground and incorporate some changes into the standards that can sort of meet our objectives as well as hopefully alleviate some of their concerns. So we're going through that process right now. We just wanted to give Council a bit of an update because it has been going on for so long. So we've sent out letters to the engineering and land development community, tell them that we're having this process with this roundtable right now. So if councillors are hearing from the development community city concerns or anything like that, they can reach out to either to me or to Toby Seward, who's the contact with the land development community. He's working with them on their sort of side of things, and we can hear their concerns and work with them. So now's the time for them to sort of reach out. So if you're aware of anything, have them contact me. So any questions?
Councillor Armstrong and Councillor
I
Bonner.
have a couple. One's coming, since now with COVID, and there's a lot of concern in the community about the lack of cul-de-sacs, because cul-de-sacs are one of the safest forms of a place to live. People like them, they want to live there. So I want to know if there's been engagement with the community since COVID, because there's more and more people that are looking at the cul-de-sacs as a good way to, you know, the kids are out safely, but you're not on the straight road. So that's something I'm really concerned about, is removing cul-de-sacs from that. So that's one question. And my other question is, we hear from the development company quite often that the cost of building has gone up a lot based on city policies. So what, with the new increment or the new proposed amendments, how much would you estimate a building is going to go up, a house price, based on what we're doing? I've heard figures from the development company anywhere, or developers, anywhere from 80,000 to 100,000. Would that be correct?
Your Worship, Councillor Armstrong, I'll address your first question around cul-de-sacs. So we haven't explicitly prohibited them in the standards. I mean, there are like current transportation best practices discourages dead-end streets because it doesn't have redundancy or connectivity and so on. We realize that sometimes those dead-end streets are really the only way to complete a development if there's like terrain constraints, such as like a rock bluff or a wetland or something like that, or just a small lot. It can be difficult. So the intention with our standards was to not explicitly allow them, but not to prohibit them, but to work with developers to, you know, create transportation systems on these parcels that make sense and sort of achieve the overall objectives. Certainly cul-de-sacs are a part of that. So this is one of the ongoing discussions we're having with this land development roundtable, is how can we alleviate their concerns while still achieving sort of like some overall objectives. And part of it might be having some language in the standards around where cul-de-sacs are appropriate and where they're not appropriate. So that's where we're potentially going to go with that. In terms of engagement, most of the engagement on this occurred in late 2018 and throughout 2019. Not a lot has happened other than this roundtable with the development community in 2020. And your other question was around
cost.
Cost, yeah. So the engineering standards don't really directly affect building construction costs. They would contribute to land development costs, and the cost of servicing a lot, for example. So the cost to build a road, the cost to build a water main, and so on. So some of the changes to the engineering standards have obviously increased the cost. Some of them have alleviated things a little bit. I mean, an example of that is the stormwater standards. You know, with what we know now about climate change and rainfall intensity and so on, the pipes are getting bigger. So that's one thing that, you know, it's really not optional for us. We have an obligation to make that kind of a change, but it does impact things. It makes things a little bit more costly. In terms of like asphalt thicknesses, for example, that's one that if we don't put it in there, if we don't increase the asphalt thickness, we're essentially passing off this cost to future generations of taxpayers that are going to have to pay for this. So we're kind of subsidizing things. So we're trying to find a good balance in there. So just to answer your question, like, we don't have a number that, because it would depend on the lot, it would depend on the parcel, it would depend on a lot of things. So there's no one number. But we've really tried to minimize the cost where there isn't a lot of value. So for example, in the property takes for road right-of-ways. So the property right-of-way widths for roads, for the developments typically built, we've really tried to maintain the existing right-of-way widths without expanding them much beyond, or at all beyond what they have. And same thing for the asphalt widths overall. Like, we've really tried to contain that.
Just as a follow-up, I did reach out to people in private industry in different communities, and they all told me that we're just bringing up the standards of what the private industries are doing. Is that correct? Like, a lot of the recommendations you're making, private industry is already having to do, like different companies are doing that already. And in different municipalities are exactly doing what you're trying to bring us forward to.
In many cases, we're bringing the NIMO engineering standards up to sort of our peer communities'
That's what I was
normal
thinking.
practices.
So this is being done.
Not in everything. There's some things where we are a little bit out ahead. You know, one of those examples is in how we've developed it's a technical way to analyze storm loading on a pipe. So that's a little bit innovative. We've also got some innovative intersections with local streets. That's a little bit innovative. But things like asphalt thickness, you know, road cross sections, they're not sort of way out there. They're kind of with our peer communities in a lot of respects.
Thank you.
Councillor Bonner.
Thank you, Your Worship. So you, staff. I appreciate all the information you've given us here. My question is regarding how we're letting the rest of the community know about this. When you guys came in with that rather large book, I imagine the whole thing isn't changing, only parts of it are changing. How is the construction industry being updated on what changes are there and how they can find them?
So over the development of this particular revision, we've had a very extensive engagement process. So we started the Complete Streets aspect of it in 2018, and we took essentially a presentation roadshow around to all the engineering firms, the development agencies that were interested in having us, as well as contractors. And we took it to real estate organizations, we took it to various places that were interested in hearing us. And so we had 40 plus engagement sessions around the community on this topic. In addition to that, we've sent many letters out to these organizations, and we've had an open ear and so on throughout the entire process. I think it's one of those things that a lot of people don't pay attention to it until maybe a bit late in the process. You realize maybe what the impact is. So although we've done a substantial amount of engagement, maybe some of the community hasn't heard us. So in particular, this land development business group, they're putting their hand up now saying we'd like a bit more input. So that's what we're taking a bit of a pause on getting the bylaw updated and we're going to sit down with them.
Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Your Worship. Really happy to see that Woonorf is snuck into the new standards there, and I think that's a great addition. And so one more comment, I think it's really great to sort of pump the brakes and just get some input on some folks that might have felt like their input wasn't captured. I'm just wondering, when we get this back in some fashion, if we could have the engagement schedule that's all been completed, done as part of that report, just because it's a little foggy, and appreciate seeing that.
So to answer your question, so the next step in the process will be another information report, and it'll include a number of attachments. So there'll be a full summary of the entire engagement, every single engagement activity. There's more than 40, it's a table of more than 40 events. That'll be included in it, as well as a number of documents that summarize all the changes, as well as answer a whole bunch of frequently asked questions around it. So the next info report will be very substantial and complete. It'll give you a lot of information. And then after that, we'll schedule the first readings of the bylaw when we think things are ready for that.
Awesome, thanks so much.
Councillor Hammonds.
Thank you, Your Worship. What you're hearing, when you closed down the engagement process and then you heard that there were maybe still some challenges in the community, are you hearing things from this group that you didn't hear in the engagement process? Like, I'm just kind of curious about, I'm hearing you say we had an extensive engagement process, yet there's people who feel like they didn't have an opportunity to have their say. So I just hope that those folks are now gonna, you know, whether it's repeated in the first version of, I don't know what I'm trying to say. Do you expect to learn new information from the second engagement process?
So through your worship, Councillor Hammond, so we've already started meeting with this land development community, and there's been some new things come out of it. There's been some reiteration of topics that we've talked about previously. So there'll be a mixture of sort of new and in some cases, there'll be some things that we just can't agree on. At the end of the day, that it's inevitable. There'll be some things that they're going to cost the land development community more, but we think it's the right thing to do for the overall community of Nanaimo and the taxpayer.
Right. It's less about the outcome and more about your process. So will you do this process differently as a result of having to reopen the engagement process this time?
So are you referring to like the next time we update the standards?
Yes.
I think what I've learned about this is I think what I would do is I would budget probably 6 months of specific engagement with the land development community after we've completed the final draft of the revision. like normally we budget about 2 years for a revision to the engineering standards, and we only budget several months for sort of the final kind of publish the red lines and so on. I think I would probably budget about 6 months for that. That's probably the only thing I would do different.
Jim?
Councillor Turley.
Thank you, Your Worship. To Mr. Rosen. Two things. Number one, I received communication from a couple of the developers who had been on a regular basis asking me questions. The latest communication said that they're being involved in the roundtable, I guess, and they're quite happy about that. So thank you for involving them. The second is it possible in the report, particularly with thickness of asphalt and that type of thing, which seem to be drawing the most resistance from the people I speak to, a comparison of what the standards are for other communities, or is it supposed to be the same right across the province?
So asphalt thickness does seem to come up quite a bit, and we do have a comparison to our peer communities, I would say. So a lot of communities on the island, as well as a lot of communities in the Lower Mainland, where the climate is kind of similar to Nanaimo. So what we've found is pretty much every community in the Lower Mainland has the same standard we're going for or better, and about half the communities on the island have the standard we're going for or better. Some of them are where we sort of are currently, about half of them on the island. We can certainly include that table in the next information report if there's some interest in that detail.
Thank you.
Anything further? Councillor Gesselbrook.
Thank you, Worship. I may have missed this in the earlier on introductions of the engineering standards, but I'm just curious, like, is it our OCP policies and council strategic plan that in areas where we decide that we're going to have higher standards than other jurisdictions, or like what sets what we choose that we have higher standards, and we just meet what other municipalities are doing, and how much weight do we put on, say, the feedback that we get from the development community in what we ultimately end up doing? What governs sort of those decisions? Is it basically, yeah?
Council.
Your Worship, Councillor Gesselbrook. So what leads into changes in the engineering standards is a whole host of things that come from sort of different angles. I mean, higher level documents like the OCP, they can set policy documents that would set the tone for like the transportation master plan, which then sets the tone for the engineering standards. And the engineering standards are really where the rubber hits the road for those folks that are designing these things in detail. So it's kind of like a trickle-down effect in terms of, or hierarchy in terms of the policy. So certainly, like, those higher level policy documents affect the direction the engineering standards will take for something like that. Now, there's also technical standards, for example, like the stormwater standards, how we analyze stormwater loading. That's a very, very complicated technical thing that, you know, staff will identify a need, and we'll go and we'll hire a specialist consultant to help advise us in terms of what those changes should be, and we'll include those into a revision. And then throughout the process, throughout the 2 years we're doing the revision, and then as time goes on, we collect comments from the development community, the engineering community, from staff, from contractors, or recommended changes to the standards. So we collect all those and we evaluate them at a period of time when we're scoping out the revision. So there's a whole bunch of different ways things can change the engineering standards.
Right, and so the feedback, as Councillor Brown is alluding to, the feedback that we get from these roundtables, that will be presented to council to review, to like see sort of what's coming from that sector in terms of potential changes being requested or whatever to our current standards.
So in terms of we could summarize the engagement, the roundtable engagement as part of the next information report. That we hadn't envisioned summarizing the engagement in that level of detail because we had a lot of feedback from the public and over the past year and a half.
I guess this is my question. Say we get a bunch of feedback from development communities, like these certain things don't make sense and we would like them changed. Would staff be like, okay, well, we'll make a compromise here or that, or if there is a change, would it come to council if it's a values-based decision, like, okay, do we want to make it cheaper for this to happen, or do we want to uphold this certain standard? are those decisions, where is those decisions ultimately being made? I guess when you do this round table, with the development community right now, and you're going to get feedback on it, that feedback, who takes that into consideration and will then from there there'll be recommended amendments to the MOESS that would be brought forward to council.
So what we would envision is, as part of this roundtable, we'll try and map out where we can find some common ground with the development community and incorporate those changes into the revision that moves forward that staff recommend for council to adopt. There could be some items that we ultimately don't agree on. What we could do is we could highlight those for council to explain what those are and why we've made the recommendation we have. That would help council be able to make a values decision when the time comes.
Mr. Rudolph, then Councillor Armstrong.
Your Worship, I think there's a couple of points here. One is, at the end of this additional process with this group of folks, there will be a summary, and they will actually have a chance to come and also present to council again. We need to make this, and anybody else for that matter, that want to do this. So we want to make this. We were hearing that there was conversation, but we were trying to bring it to a place where we could have clarity of process here today. So that we're identifying this, and that there has been a group that are starting to stick handle that on behalf of the development community, but maybe not all. And the development community is not all of the community. They're just that investor group. So that's one thing. So we'll try to bring this out so there'll be a place when everybody knows when there'll be an opportunity to present. It may not be till September or something. The second thing is that this is an illustration of a connection between aspirational policy and feet in the ground. And at the practical side of the development community represents in many ways where the rubber hits the pavement, the ground, and so there's a practical side to this. So there's usually often a cost to the aspirational policy changes that we want. So that's not necessarily a bad thing, but so you have to kind of find a nuance in there that you're comfortable with, and it is change. And any times that you incorporate proposed change, there's likely to be some differences of opinion. I guess the last point that I noted at the meeting that I attended is that in almost all cases of the city, all the easy stuff is gone. So we're now in a more challenged terrain, and it's not easy, and we don't want it to be overburdensome, but it's also an area that's most difficult to develop on. So the likelihood that there would be some compromises with respect to best practices with street grades and cul-de-sacs is, it's probably going to be more exceptions. And I guess the last thing I'd mention, and this has been mentioned earlier on, is that the handoff at some point in time would come back to the city. And that'll be there in perpetuity. And, think of then the operational implications of that being maintenance and longevity of the infrastructure that's put in. Secondly, is it going to be functional and safe for the fire trucks to get in and out, bus service, snow plows, all those types of things, which you ultimately end up in the council of the days in basket as challenges and complaints. So you want a community that actually reflects a great place to live, and not just its most affordable way to do it. I'm not saying this group is arguing that, but we're into these conversations that do have material impacts, and then the issue of affordability does come up, and this is the affordability for single-family development, and and that's fair because that's an aspirational goal for a lot of families is to have that. So all those pieces are part of this discussion, and actually many of them were visited at that meeting that Paul coordinated last week with this group of the development community. So it was very interesting, and there will probably be some differences of opinion, or at least I get areas where, and I think what the group were really asking for is at this time, let's have another kick at this and we'll see if we can't work it out. And I definitely saw a positive attitude there with people wanting to find solutions and realizing that they won't get everything they necessarily want, but they want to make sure that this is on the table, and you should be aware of it as well.
Conscious of time, Councillor Armstrong.
I just want to say I do want to see all the community engagement, and that goes for anything. I don't care if it's pipes or whatever, if it's roads or if it's buildings. Like, I think it's really important that we know what our community has told us. I don't want a summary. I want to see it like we did with the Mitchell Drive, which I thought was awesome to see everybody's comments from the surveys. I think it's really important because I read them all, and I would guess that 100% of us read all the comments. I'm very confident in that. I think it's really important for us to get that feedback. We're smart enough to know when people are blowing smoke up on you know what. So I just think it's really important that we get that information, because it's a huge thing for me to know what the community wants. And when the OCD comes up, it's the same thing. Like, my whole end of town doesn't want densification, but that's what some people are pushing, because some people like. So I think that's really important discussions that we look at that, because we're making sometimes policies not based on what the community wants. So, thank you.
Councillor Gesselbart.
Yeah, I think that's my point, is that like these engineering standards hold a lot of weight, like naturally what gets implemented and what gets done, and there is going to be quite a lot of like debate, and there's different interests at play in terms of like affordability and cost, in terms of aspirational goals, and like ultimately those are political decisions. And I just feel a little bit out of the loop in terms of what these conversations are and what recommendations or things are being considered to be changed. And I just want to make sure that ultimately it comes to the political table to like make the yay or nay on those decisions, decide where do we want to go. If it is a decision between cost and aspirational goals, that's an important discussion to be having at this table, and I just want to make sure it's happening. Maybe there isn't, and maybe the process is already there, but I just wanted to say, like, yeah, make sure that it does come here, and I'll make sure that I'm tuning to everything that is. So.
What's next? Mr. Sims, did you want to say something?
Just, I think, I don't know if you heard Mr. Rosen say it. Thank you, Worship. Just that really what's forming a lot of the engineering standard changes are the aspirational policies, the strategic plan.
Did you wake up higher?
Environment.
I never thought I'd say.
I like my jacket. Richards.
It's this thing.
But it is those aspirational goals that drive, why do we have complete street standards is really, it's part of that aspirational goal. And we recognize it's sometimes a shock to the development community, and they'll always prefer to continue doing the way things they've done. But this is an opportunity to bring them along, and for us to realize where we may have taken too big of a bite.
If no further questions, thank you very much, Mr. Rosen, Mr. Sims, everybody.
Recess?
Yeah.
Just,
5 minutes.
Yeah.
I mean 5 minutes.
2.5.
I'll give agenda. The next is other business. Item 5, Councillor Brown, motion for relocation of roadway services. And we do have 2 delegations. And I would ask Mr. Bartow to come in now, if you can, please.
I have to start myself.
Just in the podium right there.
Not sitting on this side of the table.
Good afternoon, Mr. Archer. Can you just identify yourself for the record and your address, and we're in your hands. Subject to what Ms. Curry tells me.
And just ensure you speak into the microphone as much as you can, because it's otherwise hard to hear. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mayor and Council. My pleasure to be able to speak. Yes, I'm not heard. All right, I will speak loudly.
No, I was making fun of myself. It's got nothing to do with
Oh, okay. All right, okay. Well,
Sorry.
tips if I'm not speaking loud enough, that's great. I appreciate that you had another item that took a while longer, but I was thinking, what could I say? Well, better to talk about cats and dogs than to fight like them, I suppose.
It keeps coming.
So here we are, moving our way through COVID-19, trying to sort out how to run a city, people to run their lives, their families, their businesses, and we're trying to make things as good as possible, given that we're probably going to be in this for quite a long time. So I'm particularly wanting to speak to Councillor Brown's motion, which I think is wonderful, given the fact that transportation is very important. It is. I think about 100 years ago, thousands of years ago, transportation was done by canoe, I think, and by foot. 100 years ago, we added a bunch of other things to that, and obviously those are important. And now we have a whole variety of different options, but now we're trying to figure out how to do this well. So what I'd like to do is focus particularly on 2 aspects of transportation that I think are the most important too. And they are safety and accessibility. So when COVID first struck, of course we needed to figure out how to stay as safe as possible. And things changed accordingly. But we also needed to give accessibility, because without accessing food, people would starve to death. That's not exactly a very safe thing to do. But we also wanted to make sure that if people were accessing food, for example, that they would do so in as safe a manner as possible. Therefore, safety and accessibility are both desired, very important. Related to the word safety is another one called security. We want to make sure that people have financial security as much as possible. Because obviously, if people can access to have services, but they can't afford them because their business is closed down or because they've been laid off, they're not very safe in the bigger sense of that term. So how do we create safety, security, as well as accessibility in our transportation system? I understand that Woodgrove has not yet applied for emergency relief, and so the businesses in there are not going to be able to be given access to funds, and therefore they're going to be in trouble. We can't do anything about what that mall decides to do, but we as a city, how can we help businesses continue to open in a way that people can access them in a safe way? How do we do that for the businesses that are open? So, Mayor and Councillor, I am most excited about what other cities are doing in this regard. I'm going to focus on one of the 3 things that I think Councillor Brown is focusing on, and that is the concept of slow streets. I want to pick on one particular street as I think an example of a slow street that has been with us for a long time. And that street is called Gillespie. Why do I think it's a slow street? It's because it's a narrow street. Because people feel friendly. It feels like a community street to me. What happens is children easily play near or close to, sometimes even on that street. I've noticed that neighbors actually visit each other on that street. They'll come out of their homes and talk to each other there. That's a slow street because any vehicle driver or cyclist going down that street naturally slows down because it's a narrow street and because other people are using that street. I think it is a slow street. And because drivers are going slower down that street, people feel safer to actually go and use it for other purposes besides just driving or parking on. I don't know if any of you, I suspect many of you, the last 2 summers got to take part in the Commercial Street closure when the Chamber of Commerce opened that to all kinds of wonderful events and businesses. I felt safe there for the first time. It was a great thing. We can't do that now because we don't want to bring those number of crowds of people down there. But I think Commercial Street is one street that's begging to be made into a slow street. Why? Because with your wisdom, stores and restaurants are now building their way out onto that street to make it more accessible to people who want to use their services and eat their food. On the other hand, we want to make sure people are safe. And if we have businesses that are now out on the sidewalk, where do pedestrians go? Do they walk out onto the street where cars can be going up to 50 kilometers an hour? That doesn't work. That's not safe. So if we want accessibility and safety, it seems to me that what we need to do is narrow the lane, or lanes, for the cars, slow the traffic down there so that people can feel safe walking around each other with the required 2-meter space. So that's one street, and I think maybe it could be made into a one-way street. But traffic does need to be there because those businesses need accessibility, because we need to have emergency vehicles going there, because we need people who are handicapped to be dropped off there. So I don't think that street should be closed at this point in time, but it could be made a slow street. And what is true of Commercial Street, I think is true of other streets in the city. There are so many residential streets. I sent an email off to you a while ago and suggested some possible streets that could be made into slower streets with slower speed limits or narrower traffic lanes so that people could walk or cycle and feel safer on those streets. And some streets, like in the city of Vancouver, what they're proposing to do is that they have some streets that are designated for local traffic only. And that also slows down the traffic because now you're not using that street as a way to get through to some other street. Those are some ways that I think would make it possible, more possible for pedestrians particularly, to feel safe to get outside. And with more people having time on their hands, and with more people wanting to be outside because they're being cooped up with their kids or whatever, they need to get out and walk to get some fresh air, which is actually better for our health anyway. So that's what I'm proposing for us for you as a council to consider. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gartshaw. I think you're only slightly over time. I was going to call you so we're doing well. I thought I saw a hand down there. No? We're okay? Councillor Martin.
Well, I just want to say thank you for the presentation. And I think that all these changes, they're little baby steps at a time. For Gillespie, it is kind of downtown, right? So I just want to let you know, I like the idea. I've been watching some of the videos. We're not New York, we're not LA, but we are a city. And slowly but surely, I think we do have to look at public spaces and the way we use our streets. So thank you for presenting.
Very good. Thank you very much. The next delegation is Kate Steffiak.
Go ahead, Kate.
Ms. Steffiak, good afternoon. Nice to see you. You can introduce yourself, address for the record, over to the mic, and speak loudly and close into it so everyone can hear you and you can be heard by the community.
Okay, wonderful. So, okay, wonderful. Thank you, Mayor and Council. My name is Kate Steffiak. I live at 1070 Nelson Street, Nanaimo, BC. I am a landscape architect on the City of Nanaimo Design Panel. Nanaimo is a wonderful place to live and has all the potential to be a great city. I also want to acknowledge and thank each of you for your dedication and service to the city as members of council, so thank you. Councillor Brown has brought forward a motion directing staff to consider options for temporarily reallocating space in our streets to provide more room for people as part of the city's pandemic response. The purpose of my presentation is to persuade council that the neighborhood surrounding the Nanaimo Regional General Hospital is an ideal location to consider because it offers a particular opportunity to think bigger, be bolder, and seize this extraordinary moment to effect a more permanent, transformational change in how we treat our streets. One reason this is true because in the hospital neighborhood, there's real ability for a temporary intervention to become permanent. This relates to need, given the uniquely intense energy in the urban ecosystem that surrounds a major hospital, as well as existing policy that explicitly supports improving the structure of the city around NRGH. Another reason relates more broadly to making our streets safer, and especially making them safer for children. If we care about children and their place in the city, streets would be designed to allow children to freely and safely occupy them. The energy around a hospital is intense. It is a 24/7 operation which acts as a magnet for hundreds of staff, visitors, and others coming and going, often under extremely trying circumstances, always centered around patients who, above all else, are trying to heal. The design and structure of a city around a hospital must reflect this reality. Street design that properly and permanently prioritizes pedestrians and the safe movement of people will make the hospital area safer for everyone. Urban design and landscape architecture that incorporates ecological restoration, rehabilitation, and care for the environment will create a healthy oasis within the city, reflecting the purpose of a hospital as a place of healing. For the NRGH in particular, there is already strong policy support for making this a reality. The hospital area plan, adopted in August 2018, describes the importance of pedestrian connection strategies and specifically calls for a wellness walk on streets surrounding the hospital. The wellness walk is envisioned as widened sidewalks and gathering spaces, street furniture and seating areas, street trees and plantings, public art and other design features to enhance the public realm. This is directly in line with Councillor Brown's motion. So much so that, put it another way, the motion calls for staff to identify where to best build wellness walks throughout the city. I suggest we start where the idea emerged and where it belongs permanently, around NRGH. I'd like to conclude by returning the idea that cities that care about children design and build streets that are safe for children. As I mentioned, I live on Nelson Street. On January 6, 2019, my neighbor, 8-year-old Lyndon Baglow, was struck and killed by a vehicle while riding his bike with his sister in front of my house. I watched helpless as life left this little boy's body for no reason beyond joyfully playing in the street. There's no telling what might have made a difference on that tragic day, but there is no doubt that the design of the street, coupled with the way it is used, contributed, and that on a street modeled after a wellness walk, fewer factors would have conspired to endanger and ultimately take the life of at least one little boy. If anything even slightly good can come out of that awful day, it would be to reimagine and rebuild the streets around the hospital to support health, safety, and the well-being of children. To that end, and for the other reasons I've described, my hope is that the City of Nanaimo look to the hospital area and consider using this pandemic response work to make a permanent and positive impact on the environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the courage and grace with which you presented just now. I appreciate it, Mr.
Question.
Councillor Armstrong.
My concern with that is that it is an ambulance route, and it is a police route, and it is a fire route. And, you know, from years of working and also working on traffic sections, you build a false sense of security when you lower the limits, number one, because those cars cannot go slower. You know, an ambulance, 5 seconds means the difference between life and death if you're getting them to a hospital. So I'd have a lot of concerns around that, and if we were to do something like that, I would want the hospital's input as well as the ambulance input and police input, because those are the two main roads bringing people when people are in a crisis. So that would be my big concern. And also, you know, and I know you referred to the little boy, I mean, a lot of times their deaths would have happened whether it's 20 kilometers or 60 kilometers. It depends on the mechanism of injury, how bad they hit their head. I've seen kids die at 20 kilometers when they hit their heads on the things, you know, and it's just a tragedy. But, you know, I do agree we have to look at some of these, but we have to be really careful with some of that.
I think that would be interesting to explore, because I do live on Nelson Street and work from home, so I observe my street more often than an average person. I've noticed the ambulance actually slows down on our street, that they reduce their speeds before they even enter our street. So I'd be curious to hear if you were to inquire about that, what the outcome would be. And I do believe we still need to consider, I don't think that should be the end-all and be-all. As you know, we have unfortunately increased the size of our emergency vehicles, and our city streets have suffered and gotten bigger in order to accommodate. And maybe we have to begin thinking about that in a bigger context.
And also, too, I would want input from the people that live in that area.
Councillor Marvin.
I just want to say thank you for the presentation first off, right? And I can understand your emotion for it. Another reason I actually drove down Nelson Road the other weekend from another person that was talking to me about it, and it was very tragic. And I think we're working throughout the city to try and prevent those types of incidents and tragedies from occurring. I was wondering because I definitely support Councillor Brown's motion. I mean, he hasn't made it yet, but when he's about to, I will support public spaces and looking at our streets and that. I was curious, I was like, oh, where will the ideas come, like where? Gillespie or where in our city? Because we're not really urban, like I said to Mr. Garshore. We're not the big cities yet. We will become larger with growth. But around the hospital area, it's a large area. So it isn't everywhere where the ambulances and that are coming in. They come in from the specific, usually through boundary, I think, or 3. But I agree. I think wellness and that, right around that area, is an awesome idea. And I think, and maybe if the hospital fits in their 2018 plan, they may want to collaborate with the city and look at what we can do together. So, thank you.
That's a city's plan.
Yeah, and so.
Oh, okay.
That was adopted.
Right. So, thank you. Thanks.
No, thanks very much. Appreciate it. Councillor Brown.
Yes, thank you, Worship. I would like to move the staff prepare a report with potential options for the reallocation of roadway space for physically distancing and temporarily using streets for pandemic recovery and response. Such items may include pavement to plaza initiatives, slow streets, and pop-up lanes for cycling, bowling, and walking.
Second. Second, Councillor Bonner. Councillor Armstrong. We'll let Councillor Brown speak to his motion first, and then we'll go to you, Councillor Armstrong.
Yeah, thank you, Worship. I think this motion here, while it touches on COVID response in terms of how we might move around the community for a variety of reasons, and transit ridership down, just mental health, getting people out and about. It also gives an opportunity, if council did proceed and staff identified some places to actually sort of pilot some of the items that we have embedded in policy. We talk about the high cost of sidewalks and redesigning the streets, and I'll be the first to admit that's a massive problem. And I think if we limit ourselves to the idea that every street needs a sidewalk and a cycle lane,
to be a street that people want to be in, we will never realize some of these things. And I think what COVID has shown in cities all over the world, to the point where NACTO came out with guidelines on how cities can respond in quite a temporary way. It gives us an opportunity to highlight some of these things in our own city where it makes sense. I think there's a lot of people that might get caught up in the hype, and I appreciate that passion, but it doesn't always make sense in every location, and some of these things have to be thoughtful. But with that said, I do think we have staff that might be pumped up to try some and find some of these items and locate them. And I do know that we have very strong existing policy support for a lot of these items. Ms. Defute pointed out the hospital area plan, which was an area that I had written down, which is in transportation mobility hub within the TMP. It talks about creating greenways and slower speeds and how that may be achieved. The South End Neighborhood Plan and the Waterfront Walkway Plan both talk about Haliburton as a greenway and being slowed and pedestrianized. And even the Harewood Neighborhood Plan, the Georgia Greenway, I think there's opportunity there, maybe not to build the greenway out, but to realize that as a slow street that runs through many blocks in Harewood that can actually be achieved. And then, when we can try those ideas out, and if they work, then we might say, hey, we might not need all these expensive approaches elsewhere and get caught in sometimes analysis paralysis that tends to produce high costs and burdens and impediments for delivery on some of these things. So, in short, I just think there's strong policy support. If we get creative and get some of the brains that we hired and paid to do some of this stuff, we might be able to realize some real cool connectivity items within our city, pilot them during COVID. If they don't work, they don't work. Nothing lost there. And if they do work, we can start to maybe say, hey, what did work, and is there ways we can do infrastructure delivery cheaper, better, quicker in the future for our community?
Councillor Armstrong.
Well, I'm in favor mostly. There's a couple concerns I have, and I think we should, because we've got thousands of streets, so that's going to be a lot for staff to look at. So I think we should establish some criteria that we're looking at. One of the things I was thinking about was we have all the neighborhood associations. Maybe they could send it out to their people and they could nominate their own streets, because then you're going to have community buy-in, because I think that's a huge issue. I think wherever we decide to do this, that we need to have the community on board, because otherwise we're going to have nothing but problems. So I think I would like to see the community consultation for the streets that we're going to look at doing it, because they're the ones most impacted by it. So that's one concern. And I do think we've got to come up with some criteria for staff, because if they're going to have to look at thousands of streets, I think that's pretty difficult. So that's fine.
Councillor Turley, Councillor Martin, and then Councillor Thorpe.
Thank you, Your Worship. Mostly I'm in favor of this motion. The only problem I have is the reference to the pandemic recovery. And I have to admit, first of all, I know I'm anal about social distancing, but with very good reason, in my opinion. The problem that I have is not so much social distancing ability on streets as it is in parks. And the example, I think I sent an email to all of you earlier today with regard to the demonstration at the Theo Sutton. That really disturbed me. And so my wife Marianne and I usually every day go for a walk, and we choose streets that A, don't have much traffic on, or B, have sidewalks. Everybody that we run into is very polite. They see you coming, one of us will go to the other side of the street. So, people are accepting that this is a reality. The one thing I will say is that I'm sure there are areas in the city that probably could benefit from this. And the one area that I would disagree with Mr. Garshaw on is Commercial Street. As a city business owner downtown for well over 40 years, I don't think I've ever seen a vehicle go more than 40K on Commercial Street. Perhaps at night when all the businesses are closed, but certainly not during business hours. So I wouldn't be in favor of that being one of the streets that we just looked at. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Martin?
Thank you. And through you, there's a couple of things. First, I was going to respond to Councillor Armstrong. I'm thinking that the whole city doesn't have to be looked at. I believe that staff is really familiar with our city and they've taken notes on, and I don't see this as being cumbersome, but I do see this as being timely. I think to go into consultations with neighborhood associations and all that, maybe that's something we do because we know that we want to work with the neighborhood associations, but in the meantime, until we get to that place where we look at making these public spaces all throughout our city, we identify one or two that could start us on that health and wellness and building a better city for the future. To Councillor Turley, I am, along with 3 other councillors that we all did attend, what many of us feel is a pandemic of racism. And I want to assure you, I was there for the majority of time, and from what I saw, everybody was really trying to social distance. The majority of people had masks. The organizers supplied free masks for anybody who didn't have it. And although I would never want to put anyone in danger, there are obviously around the world, there is a need where people felt that somehow this pandemic of racism superseded the pandemic of COVID. I hope that maybe we have a herd immunity and that maybe we don't have a second wave from it. That's my eternal optimism. But I just wanted to explain that from my point of view. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Thorpe.
Thank you, Your Worship. I said to Councillor Brown during the break that he would have to convince me on this because I wasn't totally convinced, despite the good intent of his motion. So I do have some concerns, although I'm not saying I won't support it. I agree with Councillor Armstrong's point about the motion being very, very broad and general. I am concerned about the amount of staff time it will take to examine all the possible options, or the process for receiving input from the community or the community groups. I guess, and I'm being really straightforward here, and I respect Councillor Brown and his intent, but I'm struggling with the motivation behind this motion, to use that term. I'm struggling to see if this is directly related to pandemic recovery. So when I read pop-up lanes for cycling, I'm thinking, how is that related to pandemic recovery? I can see providing more social or physical distancing for sidewalks, but I'm also seeing the pandemic, I think, being used here as an excuse for experimenting with our streets and how we design them. And maybe that's fair enough. But I think if this is directly related to recovery from pandemic, why is it not coming forward as a suggestion or an idea from the Mayor's Task Force on recovery? And maybe this is something that should be referred to that task force, because otherwise it's not really about the pandemic and recovery. It's just about how we build our streets and design our urban centers. So are we confusing two separate things here? Certainly I'm concerned about input from the business community. That will be very important. I'm also concerned about what do we mean by temporarily using streets for this pandemic recovery. Because I heard one of our presenters say it would lead to making more permanent change in how we treat our streets. So what do we mean by temporary? How do we define that? What limits are we putting on this experiment? Because that's what I think it would be. So those are some of my concerns. Reallocation of roadway space. In some situations, that might be valid. In others, I might struggle with it. So I'm interested in further comments. I'm not jumping to support this. but I hope I've explained my reservations. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. In order, Councillors Brown, Hammonds, Armstrong, Gesselbrock, and Markham.
Yeah, thank you. I think these are great questions. And it is a big city with a long roadway, but I agree that our staff know it best, and I think the reason it's written in a broad manner is to allow them the freedom to do their job, and I would expect that any follow-up report would cover considerations such as consulting with any neighborhood associations, any impacted residences, and any businesses to sort of manage it. You know, just like they do with most projects, and we always do our best to hear from impacted voices. So I think to address that, I really try to leave it broad and allow them to do their jobs that I think they know how to do, and do the best intentions. And I think if there was obviously this would have to come back to council, and if there was concerns that they could be addressed then if council passes today. With respect to Councillor Thorpe's comments, I think you're right. Part of the intention here is instrumental in a certain way of using the pandemic to trial things that I think actually has strong policy support when I read our documents, and when I think about recovery, I'm not just thinking about quickly getting back to the way things were. I'm thinking about getting things back to better, going better, going further, taking things further than they have been before. So when I think about recovery, I think about a better city, a more livable city that is enshrined in a lot of our policy documents, is touched upon in a variety of ways in our strategic plan. So I view this as a way, when things like transit ridership are down, more people are out on the streets that are maybe walking or cycling where they haven't before. Sort of best planning practices, we do know we need to make those, like actually Ian touched on really well, as safely and secure as possible, as accessible as possible, and that's what our planning documents speak to, transportation master plan especially. But then recovery, I think, is going past that and saying, well, where do people want the city to go, and what are the best practices, what are the trends that we're seeing around livability? And so I think we can use some of these things to pilot initiatives now that may address some of those long-term concerns. And if they don't work, they don't work, and that's what you learn.
Thank you. Councillor Hammonds.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just voicing my support for this motion. I think, Councillor Thorpe, I agree with you. I was a little confused by the COVID thing, because I think this is something that does have policy support, and this is something that this council has expressed interest in, but COVID gives us the opportunity because there are fewer people on the streets, and I think people are looking at alternative modes of transportation. I'm not a huge fan of the hospital area because it is so car-centric, and it would be major modifications. I think looking at a neighborhood maybe closer to downtown that already has some walkability, and we're just improving it to kind of demonstrate. I don't think we should ever be afraid to try something new, and I think this is a really good opportunity to do that. So I'm in full support.
Councillor Armstrong.
For me, this has nothing to do with COVID. I think it's something we should look at regardless of COVID. Like, I know people will be surprised, but I do think it's something we need to look at. But a couple concerns that come to mind right away is we do have a lot of issues on Lost Lake Road with major speeding, and I mean, I've been up there myself, and people are doing 100, more than that. Same thing with Extension Road. So I don't know if those are two roads that could possibly be looked at for some of these things, because I think it would have huge community support if we could slow down the traffic up there, whatever means, and make it safer. So those would be two that I'd be very interested in looking at. But for me, this has got nothing to do about COVID. It's about looking at how can we make our neighborhoods more friendly. When the motion came up, I was thinking about, like, I've grown up and lived in 14 different cities. What did I like about each one of them? And I keep going back to my towns and prairies where you could walk any place. We didn't have sidewalks, but you walk any place, it was relatively safe. I know it was a different era, but And so I understand where he's coming from. Like, you want to be able to feel safe walking in the neighborhoods, and I think that's something if we can do through experimenting, as long as it doesn't cost us a whole bunch of money. I'm all for it.
Councillor Gesselbrock.
Thank you, Worship. I support this motion. I think that there's strong policy, very strong policy support for these type of actions, and I think in terms of COVID, there's definitely an increased interest and opportunity to try out some of these measures where there'll be significant support for it, and we need to take advantage when opportunities are presented. So thank you.
Councillor Marvin.
Thank you. I have read where actually people that don't have cars and use transit actually are getting on their bicycles more, because with COVID they're not as comfortable using the transit system. So we might have more people out walking and using bicycles. But if we were to use something like Commercial Street, then I agree, businesses absolutely have to be consulted and work with us, etc., etc. But some of these public spaces or improving things can also be, for instance, Gillespie Street, just throwing that out there because Mr. Gartshore, is residential. There is no business on it to really have to consult. So I think when the staff, if the motion passes, if the staff will probably already be able to pinpoint what little spaces we might be able to improve or within our city. So that's my response. Thank you.
Much as it's late in the day, I can't resist saying something about this motion. And it's something I said before, I think in an email to all of you earlier, that it just seems to me we've arrived in the 21st century and all we're really trying to do is recreate a village. And it's where people knew each other, where we didn't have police forces the way we think of them, because we knew our neighbors, we knew who was dangerous, and we knew who wasn't dangerous, and we knew everybody's business, and we could walk everywhere because, after all, we built them around pedestrian activity or carts and horses or whatever, but we didn't build them around the automobile. So now we're spending a great deal of time in public resources trying to bring back something that existed hundreds of years ago, but it also existed in the context of no public education, no public health care, no social services, and governance that wasn't democratic in form. So having said all that, I think we need to look at it, but I don't enter this process or support of this motion with an enormous amount of optimism, because to recreate these things is going to be expensive, potentially. Councillor Brown has suggested that, perhaps it can be done in less expensive ways. Don't worry about sidewalks, really, don't worry about other things. I think for many people, what they're thinking about are nice little plazas like if they're happily members of the bourgeoisie, they've seen in Europe, or colonial towns in Mexico, or wherever they've been. We're again, cities much larger than ours. We're a blip in the universe. How many cities in China have more than 10 million people, for heaven's sakes? We're a blip in terms of urban landscapes. How do we recreate that? I think people look back with very happy memories of what the Chamber of Commerce through its initiative was able to achieve in Commercial Street, but that was only one night a week. You're not going to have that kind of population concentration. When you talk about walkable neighborhoods, of course they walk down Gillespie Street. It's a nice narrow little street, and it's a social neighborhood, and as Councillor Martin pointed out, all the businesses that used to exist in that area of town have disappeared and shut their doors, and there's no corner grocery store, there's no pharmacist, there's no physicians, there's none of the people who used to live there. It's strictly a residential area subject to commercial space a bit further beyond. But you know what? It's worth studying, if for no other reason than for us to determine what it is we can reasonably do in terms of creating an environment where people will feel comfortable walking and or riding and not be car-centric. But as I say, I'm not going to pretend that I'm coming into this with piles of optimism, because it's going to be very, very hard. And the reality is, if you shut down a street to vehicular traffic, which is what we're really talking about here, shifting us to active transportation, there will be a reaction from people who still rely on the automobile, and whose whole lives have been shaped by the automobile, as it has been for several generations now. And doing this stuff is not going to be easy. Even today, I mean, we heard from Councillor Hammonds talking about the hospital district. Absolutely, thoroughly car-centered. I was sitting here listening and thinking, you know what, that's a lovely idea, but I have trouble finding a parking spot because, with great respect, I don't have time to take public transportation or figure out a bus route to get to the Child Development Centre when I've had to go there for various meetings or whatever over time. I'm thinking about a parking spot, and the place is already inundated with vehicular traffic. So it's going to be complex. Councillor Bonner and then Councillor Turley.
Thank you, Your Worship. If I have to run out, it's because the doctor's going to call me in a couple minutes, but I'll try to speak very fast. Bus number 30 is the one you want to get serious. If I don't want to say this, one thing is I don't look at this as a COVID getting better, recovering from, because the virus isn't going away anytime soon. So I look at this more as it's going to be around for a long time. Social distancing is going to be around for a long time. How do we now look at ways of encouraging and helping out those people who are already walking on the streets, who are already riding their bikes on the streets, which has gone up tremendously. And there's many streets that we could actually help them out. And that may be the long-term plan. So it's less about recovery, it's about dealing with this pandemic in its after effects for a very long time from now.
Thank you.
Your Worship, just asking for a little further clarity perhaps from the mover on the intent of the motion in terms of timing. As you're aware, there's an active transportation plan and all that's underway, and all that will inform, I think, future decision making. But and then we have the current pandemic, and you know the rush that some of the larger cities in North America and other places have done to make temporary arrangements for, which is kind of related to the less amount of traffic on the road. So I'm just wondering, are you expecting a report within a month or 2 months or that type of thing? Because that will change the nature of how much time is invested by staff in it and how strategic you would like it. Or are you looking more for a combination of more strategic longer term as well as short-term opportunities that could be, with temporary markings and, signage and that type of thing? I suspect you're looking for both with this, but any additional guidance in terms of your expectation in terms of getting back to you, because we are now heading into summer and there will be more people out and about anyway. So I'm just seeking a little direction so we come back in the appropriate time frame with the right amount of information to address what you're asking for at this time.
I'll go to Councillor Brown and then I'll get to Councillor Turley's question.
Yeah, through you, Your Worship, thank you. It's a good question. I think any long-term stuff is already embedded in the plans and it's being done in the active transportation plan. But to me, we're pretty strategy heavy and planning heavy. And I've thought that before this motion, and I think it's time to put some of these things in action. Like I looked at what Victoria shut down Government Street with two cement blocks and 3 2x4s. Like that's definitely not a long-term infrastructure, but it's enough for them to trial out what it might look like. So to me, I would be looking for a shorter timeline to see some of these things realized. And like I said, I don't think it needs to be like 20 streets. It could be. I think there's probably some staff members that have some pretty good ideas where something might work quickly, and if it doesn't, and staff go back and say, yeah, there's really nothing. I would expect that honesty to be reflected at any point.
Councillor Turley.
Thank you, Your Worship. So I look upon this as an investigative motion without any dollars attached to it, and I like Councillor Armstrong's suggestion that it be limited to specific streets that we already know there's an issue with. The Long Lake, or Lost Lake is certainly one of them. The other one I can see becoming an issue with the densification along this street is Halliburton, particularly the 200 block Halliburton. So if we can limit it to those as opposed to, as a trial, as opposed to trying to spend a lot of time finding other streets where we're going to end up with the challenge of, why can't we have our street looked at, or somebody in Harwood wants theirs and somebody else in the we've already know about the issues in those particular streets. So I'll support it on that basis. However, future support would have to be proven a little more dramatically to me, shall we say. Thank you.
Councillor Thorpe.
Thank you, Your Worship. I don't mind being a minority of one, but I will support the motion with my reservations on record. I never, or hardly ever, object to getting information from staff, but I'm really struggling between long-term, short-term. It has to do with pandemic recovery. It doesn't have to do with pandemic recovery. In the long term, we have a philosophy of complete streets, which our staff look at whenever we have projects in neighborhoods. And if it's just short-term, I would definitely need, as Councillor Turley said, to look at the specifics of what is being suggested on what streets, what measures are being put in place, for how long, and if it's simply an anti-car measure, then I will have real problems supporting it. So, having said that, I'm willing to go ahead and let staff come back and we'll see what they have to say.
And looking at the hour, I'm really hopeful that everyone's have their say.
Call the question.
All those in favor? Opposed? No one contrary. Thank you very much. The next item is 5B, governance processes discussion to appropriate. Ms. Gurry.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm going to try to be as brief as possible. I had a bunch of information prepared. I first wanted to go over and give you a brief update of where we're at with some of our governance processes because of COVID-19 and the pandemic, and how we got here and how it's progressed since then. But I won't go through all of that. Basically, you all know we're still in a pandemic. There's still a ministerial order that we must abide by, and the guidelines and recommendations are changing. And as they change, we will adjust and reflect those changes.
Could you speak up a little? I see Councillor Turley hinting with his hand earphone that maybe...
Do you want the mic?
Here, the mic.
Yeah.
One problem, the strategy.
But as for the further discussion on... Thank you, Kelly. As for the further discussion on some of the governance-specific topics that you wanted to speak of, such as correspondence, is one that I wanted to just bring to this table and have you all have a talk about possibly developing a policy that's more clear than what's in our procedure bylaw. And question period, I know Councillor Thorpe wanted to talk about question period, and any other matters, maybe we postpone that to the 6th meeting. So what I really wanted to have you guys have the opportunity to really do a roundtable and talk about some of those certain items that are contained in our procedural bylaw, and see if there was some policies that we could develop and bring back to you to clarify some of those matters, and see if there's anything else that you wanted us to have a look at. But because of the time, and I want you to be able to have that time, possibly postponing it. And then just to let you know that the reason some of these matters I think have come up is because of how our governance processes have had to be altered because of the pandemic. So you've been doing Zoom meetings, you've been attending via Zoom, we've had delegations coming to items limited to only those items on the agendas, and question period has been put on hold, and we tried to do some different things around question period. So I know that that's why it's brought it to the forefront. So I just want to give you the opportunity, and then based on some direction and feedback after you've had that conversation, we could go back and prepare some
Thank
things.
you. We have a fairly extensive in-camera agenda already, and you're asking for a straw poll, so can we limit our comments to like 30 seconds each of us to potentially just give some idea whether question period, correspondence, and policies are important to all of you, etc. Councillor Armstrong and Councillor Martman.
I would just like to say I think we should be moving all of our meetings down to the Shaw Auditorium where we can socially distance properly, and then if we could even have a question period there because people can stay outside. Thank you.
Councillor Martin?
I suggest, due to we have such extensive posts that actually we move this so we can all have a healthy discussion to next meeting. Such it.
If I don't see any great objection to that suggestion, already proposed by Ms. Gurry and supported by Councillor Martin. Councillor Turley?
Yeah, I'm fine holding it off till another date.
Excellent. That's what we're going to do then. Executive decision. Thank you very much. I like this. In terms of correspondence, the Select Standing Committee, I think we can still send something to the committee, I'm going, and what I'm going to suggest is that it be as simple as a letter from me suggesting that the issues around homelessness, mental health, addictions issues, etc. are crucially important to this city. They still absorb most of our correspondence from the public in a general way, and that we propose that the government look at further funding and more substantive contributions and changes, as much as we appreciate what they're doing already. Councillor Hemmons.
Thank you. I support that. And would we have an opportunity to review it before you send it?
No, I'm going to do it in secret. No. Much as I'm tempted. Thank you. All right, let's move on. Agenda planning, Ms. Gurry.
Thank you, Your Worship. So Mr. Rudolph suggested I produce or have my staff produce in short form just a PowerPoint slide version of the package that's attached to your agenda, just to give you a highlight and get some confirmation that you're okay with the meetings for the remainder of June and July. So we just wanted to kind of put it up there, let you know what's coming, and see if you're okay with that.
Councillor Armstrong.
Is it possible to have social procurement sooner? Because I think that's going to really have a big play on us with what's going on, you know?
Your Worship, just just through you to Councillor Armstrong, that is the date that the consultant that was working on social procurement is set to come for that, and as well the governance discussion that we just postponed will probably be put up there as well, if you're okay with that.
Doesn't sound like we have much choice. Councillor Martin?
Is it appropriate for me to say, though, due to COVID, I was looking for something else in the future to be added, and that's food security. And it's been brought to my attention in talking to some of the local farmers that what's going to happen is a lot of the people that are temporary workers that help out the farmers are not being there. So produce at harvest time may not be to the markets as soon as they should be. Most likely it will drive up food prices. It will make food security, and I think Nanaimo, we are proud of our support of farmers markets and security. So I think it might be something we have to look at. It might be in the fall, but I think it's something that we should have on our agenda, or I suggest we have on our agenda.
Before I go to Councillor Bonner, I don't disagree with you in the long term, and the issue around foreign workers and their admission to Canada is you will appreciate, and I see you nodding, you know what I'm going to say, federal matter, but Councillor Bonner?
Well, I was just going to say that the House and Housing Task Force, as they review their food security, might come with some options.
Perfect.
We can talk about it then.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Your Worship, just to clarify this, so we're trying to just do some agenda planning. There could be other items added to these, but just sort of those larger topics. Like today, unfortunately, we budgeted we thought the major time frame would actually be for this topic that we didn't get to today, and we didn't think the first part would be quite so long.
Right.
So it's hard to sometimes know how long it will take.
Yeah.
So we're just bookmarking sort of the large topics, and there can always be other ones I'm aware that we could add. So we'll try to fill that as best we can, but we do have 3 of these scheduled meetings between now and the August break. So that's currently what we're targeting to bring forward, but there's room to bring other things as well, except the 22nd looks pretty full with 3 very large reports coming from the Reimagine Nanaimo and Environment area. So I think that one might be, so, and we need to come back to you with this workshop on COVID and other just question periods, so there's a blend there. And there'll be more on that coming to council anyway in the near future as we unpack that for you. So apologize for the way this is going, but it's fairly fluid, but this is kind of where we're at right now.
Perfect.
Was it Jimmy Durante or W.C. Fields said about show business, never share a stage with children or dogs?
W.C.
Councilor
Fields.
Thorpe, W.C. Fields.
Churchill.
Thank you, Your Worship. There is another topic that I'd like to suggest, and it actually relates to Councillor Brown's in-camera motion today. So I don't know what I can say, except that it, in general terms, has to do with the topic of our philosophy of property acquisition.
Okay.
And I can maybe
Thank
speak
you.
more to it when we go in camera.
Yes, sounds good. Anything further for Ms. Gurry on the issue of upcoming GPCs and council topics? If not, thank you very much. I would ask for a procedural motion to proceed in camera then. Moved Councillor Thorpe, seconded Councillor Bonner. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you very much. I would now like to call the